The letter arrived on a Tuesday. By Friday, Silas Crowley was gone, bags packed, debts unpaid, and not a single word left for the woman traveling 800 miles to become his wife. He didn't leave an apology. He didn't leave an explanation. He left nothing but a forwarding address, scrawled in someone else's handwriting, that led exactly nowhere. Maribel Wren stepped off that train carrying one suitcase, $11 and 31 years of trying to be exactly what everyone needed her to be. And the moment she set foot on that platform, every woman in Hollow Ridge turned to look at her. The way people look at something they've already decided isn't worth the trouble. She was 31. She was alone. She had been promised a home. If that were you standing on that platform, watching the crowd part around you like water around something unwanted, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Maribel. The train was 40 minutes late pulling into Hollow Ridge, and by the time it finally groaned to a stop, Maribel had already rehearsed the moment 17 times in her head. She'd imagined Silas standing at the far end of the platform, hat in hand, looking nervous the way men look when they're about to do something that matters. She imagined him being shorter than she expected, or taller, or having a voice that didn't match his letters. She'd been prepared for disappointment in small ways. She had not been prepared for the platform to be completely empty of anyone waiting for her at all. She stepped down from the train car holding her suitcase in both hands, because the handle had been broken since Kansas, and she'd learned the hard way that one-handed was a gamble. The morning air hit her cold, dry, carrying the smell of horses and wood smoke, and she stood there for a moment just breathing it in, telling herself he was late. That was all. Men ran late. It happened. Around her, the platform moved, with arriving passengers meeting their people, hauling bags, calling out names. A woman laughed somewhere to her left, high and sharp. A child ran past so close it nearly clipped her elbow, and Maribel stood still in the middle of all of it, searching every face, and found no one searching back for her. She waited 45 minutes. She told herself she was not the kind of woman who panicked. That was true. Mostly, she'd spent most of her adult life being the steady one, the daughter who's home while her sister married, the neighbor who helped pack up houses after people died, the woman who held things together because falling apart required a luxury of time she never quite had. She was good at waiting. She was good at keeping her face calm while her insides worked through something difficult. But 45 minutes on that platform with her suitcase balanced across both arms and her good traveling dress, slowly picking up dust that tested her. She finally walked to the station agent's window. The man behind it was somewhere around 60, with a mustache that had seen better decades, and the expression of someone who'd been asked too many questions by too many strangers. "Excuse me," Maribel said. "I'm looking for a man named Silas Crowley. He was supposed to meet me here. Do you know him?" The station agent looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite pity, not quite recognition. Something in between that made her stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. Crowley said, "Yes, Silas Crowley. He's a rancher, I believe. He wrote that his property was about 4 miles east of Minas. I know who Silas Crowley is." The agent set down his pen. He looked at her again. The way people look when they're calculating how much of the truth to give someone. "Ma'am, I don't know how to say this in a way that's going to sit easy, but Silas Crowley left Hollow Ridge about 3 weeks ago, middle of the night. Word got around he had debts that had gotten considerably larger than he had." Maribel heard the words. She processed them in order, the way she processed most difficult things methodically, without letting herself react until she'd understood fully. "Left," she said. "Yes, ma'am, 3 weeks ago. Closer to 4 now, I think." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, she could hear 2 women talking in the low, carrying way of people who are trying to sound like they aren't discussing something they absolutely are. She didn't turn around. Did he leave anything? A letter or a message? Or nothing that I'm aware of. The agent's voice had gotten slightly softer, which somehow made it worse. Pity always made things worse. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I truly am." She thanked him. She didn't know why she thanked him. It was automatic, the please and thank you and excuse me that had been drilled into her since she was small enough to believe that politeness was a kind of protection. She picked up her suitcase and turned around. The two women who had been talking behind her stopped talking. They were both older than Maribel by a good 15 years, dressed well, standing close together the way women stand when they've been friends long enough to form a unit. One of them narrow face, dark coat, the kind of expression that had probably looked disapproving since birth looked Maribel up and down with slow, unhurried clarity. "You're the one he sent for," she said. It wasn't a question. Maribel said nothing. "From back east somewhere. He advertised, didn't he? In one of those papers." She said those papers the way certain people say certain things, with just enough disdain that it would be hard to object to, without sounding oversensitive. A mail-order arrangement. "That's one way to describe it," Maribel said. "Well." The woman glanced at her companion. Silas Crowley was never what you'd call reliable, even before the debts. "I imagine someone should have warned you, but I don't suppose anyone knew to." Her companion made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Wasn't quite anything, but landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Maribel picked up her suitcase both hands, careful of the handle, and walked away from them. She had $11. She didn't know this town. She didn't know a single person in it. The man who'd promised her a future had run from his own and apparently hadn't thought about her long enough to send word. She had a return ticket that wouldn't be valid for another 2 weeks because she'd bought the kind, assumed she'd be settled in before she needed it again. And she had no way to afford a hotel for 2 weeks on $11, and whatever odd work she could find in a town that already knew her name as a punchline. She sat down on a bench at the edge of the platform and looked out at the street beyond. Hollow Ridge was not a small town, exactly. It was a frontier town, which was different. It had the bones of ambition without having quite finished growing into them. Storefronts that were still relatively new. Streets that turned to mud after rain. A church with a fresh coat of paint that suggested someone cared about appearances. People moved through it with the slightly too buzzy quality of people who've noticed something and are trying to look like they haven't. She understood, sitting on that bench, that they were talking about her. She'd expected this might happen. She'd thought about it on the train, the possibility that something could go wrong, that she could arrive and find things not what she'd imagined. She was 31, not 20, and she'd stopped believing in smooth outcomes sometime around her 24th birthday when her mother got sick, and the world revealed itself to be considerably less organized than anyone had let on. She'd expected possible embarrassment. She had not expected it to feel quite this sharp. She opened her purse and counted the $11 again. She didn't know why. The number wasn't going to change. That was when she heard the footsteps, small, quick, and deliberate, in the way that children's footsteps are deliberate when they've made a decision about something. She looked up. The little girl was maybe 5 or 6, with brown braids that had started the morning neat and were losing the battle, and a blue dress that had a small tear at the hem that someone had attempted to mend with thread that was slightly the wrong shade of blue. She was standing about 4 feet away, looking at Maribel with the kind of focused, open curiosity that children have before they learned that staring is rude. Maribel waited for the child to lose interest. Children usually moved on quickly. This one didn't. She took 2 steps closer instead, tilted her head. And then, with the absolute confidence of someone who has thought something through completely and is no longer uncertain, she turned back toward the crowd on the platform and raised her voice. "That's my mama," she announced. "Right there. That's her." Everything stopped, or it felt like it did. The conversations closest to them went quiet in the spreading way that quiet spreads, and Maribel watched heads turn, and she had about 3 seconds of complete and total confusion before a man pushed through the thinning crowd with the expression of someone who'd just been publicly placed in a situation he had not agreed to. Most of its windows were dark. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work physically, with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and something harder than sun. Somewhere said early to mid-30s, she guessed, though the set of his jaw suggested he'd aged in ways that didn't show directly in years. He had the little girl's same brown eyes, and they were currently fixed on his daughter, with an expression caught somewhere between mortification and exhaustion. Tilly. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man who didn't raise it often, but when he did, people noticed. "Come here." The little girl Tilly did not come there. She pointed at Maribel instead. "I told you she'd come. I told you." "Tilly, she's right here, Papa." She came on the train. Most of its wind reached his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder and looked up at Maribel with an expression that managed to combine genuine apology with profound wish. This weren't happening. I'm sorry, he said. She does this. She's been doing this. He looked briefly like he might explain further, then seemed to decide against it. I apologize for any— It's all right, Maribel said. She doesn't mean understand. She kept her voice even. She was good at even. She's not bothering me. Tilly, apparently taking this as full permission, took 2 more steps toward Maribel and looked at her suitcase with frank assessment. That's broken, she observed, pointing at the handle. It is, Maribel agreed. Papa could fix it. He fixes things. Tilly. The man's voice carried a specific kind of weariness, not anger, just the exhaustion of someone who has had this exact type of conversation many times and has not yet found a way to redirect it effectively. She is not— He stopped, looked at Maribel again, and something in his face changed slightly, like he just noticed something he hadn't registered the first time. Are you all right? It was such a simple question, such a completely ordinary question. And Maribel had been asked it dozens of times in her life and had always answered yes, because yes was easier and also because she was usually fine enough. But something about being asked it here by this stranger with his daughter who had just publicly claimed her in front of half the town, something about it made the yes stick for just a second. So, I've had a difficult morning, she said. He looked at her and at her suitcase and at the direction she'd come from the platform, the station agent's window, and she could see him working something out. He was not a man who moved quickly through things, she sensed. He thought before he spoke. That was increasingly evident. Crowley, he said. It wasn't a question either. It landed flat and certain, the way a stone lands. Yes, she said. Something moved through his expression. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't pity or not only pity. It was the particular look of a person who had already heard a version of a story and is now looking at the person the story happened to and finding that person more real and more complicated than the story made them. I'm Gideon Rourke, he said. He offered his hand. She shifted her suitcase and shook it. Maribel Wren. I know who you are, he said. He said it without apology, which she appreciated. Half the town knew who she was by now. Pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of condescension. Where are you staying? She looked at him steadily. I haven't worked that out yet. Tilly had inserted herself between them at some point and was now standing with her arms at her sides, looking up at Maribel with an expression of someone watching a plan come together. She can have supper with us, the little girl said. Tilly, you said people who need help should get help. A pause. Gideon Rourke closed his eyes for one single second. It was the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone who weighs 40 pounds. When he opened them, he looked at Maribel with the expression of a man who is not entirely sure how he arrived here, but is not yet willing to retreat. She's right that I said that, he said. Would you? It would be no trouble. A meal, at least. You can take time to think through your situation. Maribel wanted to say no. She was very good at saying no to things she suspected might make her life complicated. She had a long history of turning down the help that came with invisible strings, and she had learned early that nothing was quite as expensive as appearing helpless. But she had $11, and it was getting toward noon. And the little girl was still looking at her with those brown eyes that held absolute certainty about something. Maribel didn't fully understand yet. That's very kind, she said finally. Just supper. Tilly grabbed her hand. Just took it, the way small children take things they've decided belong to them, without asking, without apology, with the simple authority of someone who has already moved past the question to whatever comes next. Maribel looked down at the small fingers wrapped around hers. She had traveled 800 miles for a man who'd decided to disappear. She had not expected to be held by anyone at all. She picked up her suitcase both hands as usual and let the little girl lead her off the platform into the dusty street of Hollow Ridge, while the women in dark coats watched and talked quietly, and the station agent pretended he hadn't seen any of it. Behind her, she heard one of the women say, distinctly, well, I suppose someone has to take her in. The other one laughed. Maribel kept walking. She had been laughed at before. She'd learned that laughter, even the mean kind, didn't actually leave marks you could see. You just carried it for a while, and then you set it down and you kept going. Tilly squeezed her hand. Squeezed back. It was the first honest thing that had happened to her since she'd gotten on that train. Gideon walked slightly behind them both, not saying anything, in the way of a man who has just agreed to something he doesn't fully understand yet and is quietly trying to determine whether that was a mistake. He wasn't cruel. She could tell that much already. Cruel men didn't look uncomfortable about things they looked comfortable. He looked like a man being stretched between two different instincts, and she didn't know which one would win. She didn't know him. She knew nothing about his ranch or his life or what had hollowed out his face the way it clearly had at some point. She knew only that his daughter had grabbed her hand in a public place and called her Mama in front of everyone, and the world had not ended. And she was still standing. And somewhere further down this unfamiliar street, there was apparently a meal that didn't cost $11. That was enough for now. She had spent 31 years surviving on enough for now. She was very good at it. What she didn't know couldn't know, standing in that street with dust on her shoes and a broken suitcase handle and a little girl's hand in hers, was that Hollow Ridge was about to teach her something entirely different. Not how to survive, how to stay. Supper at the Rourke house was not what Maribel had expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected, something austere, maybe, given the quiet tension that seemed to live in Gideon Rourke's shoulders. Something sparse. What she found instead was a kitchen table that was too big for two people, with mismatched chairs and a window that let in the last of the afternoon light in a way that made everything look warmer than it probably was. The stove was iron and old and clearly knew what it was doing. The shelves held flour, salt, dried beans, 3 jars of something that had been put up last summer judging by the color, and a coffee tin that had been repurposed to hold pencils. Tilly had insisted on showing Maribel all of it. "That's where we keep the good matches," she said, pointing to a small tin box on the highest shelf. "Papa puts them up there so I don't get into them, but I know where they are." "I can hear you," Gideon said from the doorway. "I know," Tilly said, unconcerned. Maribel set her suitcase down beside the door. She hadn't been invited any further into the house, and she wasn't about to assume and watched the two of them move around each other in the kitchen with the practiced, slightly off-balance rhythm of people who have learned to compensate for someone who used to be there. It was subtle. The way Gideon reached for a pot on the left side of the stove and then stopped and reached right instead, like old muscle memory correcting itself. The way Tilly set 3 plates without being asked, and then looked at one of them for a second too long before moving it into position. 3 plates, Maribel noticed that. Gideon made stew. It was competent stew, not inspired but honest. The kind made by someone who had learned to cook out of necessity and had made peace with it. He didn't apologize for it, which she appreciated. Were dark. She'd eaten in houses where they apologized for everything they put on the table, and it made eating feel like a negotiation. They sat. Tilly immediately began talking, covering the silence with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting all day for an audience larger than one. She talked about a horse named Bucket, who had an opinion about everything. She talked about how she was teaching herself to read using a book about plants, because it was the only one she'd found with good pictures. She talked about a family down the road whose dog had puppies in October, and how 2 of them had not survived, and how she'd buried them herself in the yard and marked the graves with flat rocks. "I said words over them," she told Maribel seriously. It seemed right. "It was right," Maribel said. Tilly looked satisfied. Gideon ate and said nothing, but not him. Maribel watching her twice quickly, the watch when they're trying to form an opinion and don't want it observed. After supper, when Tilly had been convinced to wash up, and Gideon had carried the plates to the wash basin, he turned to Maribel with the directness of a man who'd been turning something over the whole meal and was done turning it. "What's your plan?" he asked. Not unkindly, just directly. "I have enough money for perhaps a week if I'm careful," she said. "I need to find work. I can sew, I can clean, I've some knowledge of medicinal plants, and basic care. I helped nurse my mother through a long illness. I'm not afraid of difficult work." He was quiet, considering. The town's not always welcoming to strangers. Especially, he stopped. Especially women who arrived expecting to marry men who ran off? She finished. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I was going to say, especially women on their own. But yes, I know what I am to this town right now," Maribel said. She said it without self-pity, which seemed to be the right instinct, because something in his posture loosened slightly. "I'm not asking for anyone's sympathy. I just need time and fair pay for fair work." He nodded slowly. There's a woman on Birch Street, Agnes Haverford. Her husband's bedridden, and she's got more laundry than she can manage. I can mention your name if you want. I'd appreciate that. A pause. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved around the corners of the house in the way prairie wind does not subtly, with intention, like it's looking for something it left. You can stay tonight, Gideon said. He said it the way he seemed to say most things, like he'd already argued with himself about it and come out the other side. The spare room. It's not much, but it's dry. Maribel wanted to say no. The same instinct as before, the one that knew help had weight, that owing people was its own kind of trap. But it was already past dark, and she had nowhere to go, and she was tired in a way that went past her feet and her back and settled somewhere deeper. One night, she said. He nodded. That was all. Tilly appeared from the hallway already in her nightdress and grabbed Maribel's hand again with the same zero hesitation she'd used on the platform. I'll show you the room, she said. You should be in bed, Gideon told her. I'm going, Tilly said. She looked at him after. He rubbed his face with one hand and said nothing. The spare room was exactly what he'd promised, not much. A bed with a quilt that was faded but clean, a window that looked out toward the barn, and a hook on the wall for hanging things. It smelled like cedar and closed-up time, the way rooms smell when no one's been in them for a while. This was Mama's sewing room, Tilly said from the doorway, matter of fact. Maribel turned to look at her. She died, Tilly continued, in the way children sometimes say the hard children's thing, not without feeling, but without the elaborate, cushioning adults use. 3 years ago, her name was Clara. She had brown hair like mine, but she was taller. Papa doesn't talk about her, but he kept her quilt. Maribel looked at the quilt. I see, she said quietly. I don't remember her voice, Tilly said. I try, but I can't. I remember her hands. She paused. That's why I wanted a mama. Not just anyone. One who had good hands. Maribel stood very still. You have good hands, Tilly said. I could tell on the platform. The way you held your suitcase. She yawned, covering her mouth with the back of her wrist. Good night. She was gone before Maribel could think of a single thing to say. Maribel sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark, not unpacking, just sitting. She thought about a man who had run from his debts and not bothered to send word. She thought about $11. She thought about a little girl who'd buried 2 puppies with flat rocks and said words over them, because it seemed right. She thought about a quilt. Then she lay down and pulled it over herself and let herself be tired. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She knew it was that fast because she'd been keeping count of something she couldn't remember what, and then she wasn't counting anymore. Morning came the way mornings do when you're somewhere unfamiliar, slightly wrong, the light coming from the wrong direction, the sounds outside unrecognized. She lay still for a moment, placing herself, the window, the barn smell, the cedar. Then she heard Tilly in the kitchen, talking to someone or something, her voice going up and down with the self-contained chatter of a child who has learned to keep herself company. Maribel got up. She straightened the quilt out of habit, then out of something else she didn't examine closely. She found the wash basin in the hall, cleaned up as best she could, put on the only other dress she'd packed, and went to the kitchen. Tilly was talking to a cat. The cat was gray and had the expression of an animal that had heard everything before and found none of it interesting. Gideon was not there. His coffee cup was empty and slightly pushed aside. He'd been up before either of them. He does the morning feeding first, Tilly said, without looking up from the cat. He'll be back. I'll make coffee, Maribel said. Tilly finally looked up. You don't have to. I know I don't. She found the coffee without having to ask. Second shelf, left side, where it made sense to be. She built the fire up in the stove, found the pot, found the water. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply doing what her hands knew how to do when they were in a kitchen. And there was work available. By the time Gideon came in from the barn, boots loud on the wood floor, the coffee was ready, and Maribel was making what she could from what was in the pantry: eggs, salt, the end of a bread loaf she'd found and sliced thin and pressed against the iron surface of the stove until it was golden. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. Coffee's on the left, she said, a pause. He poured himself a cup. He sat down. He didn't say thank you right away, and she noticed that not as a failing, but as honesty. He'd gotten used to doing without thanks or being thanked. It took a moment for the instinct to surface. Thank you, he said, when she set the plate in front of him. It's your food, she said. I just arranged it. Tilly laughed at that for reasons that seemed personal to her. They ate. It was less awkward than supper the night before, which Maribel attributed to daylight. Most things are less awkward in daylight. Gideon ate steadily, with the focused efficiency of a man with work waiting, and Maribel ate and thought about Agnes Haverford on Birch Street and whether to go there this morning or give it one more day. She decided this morning. Waiting made things harder. I'll go find Mrs. Haverford today, she told Gideon. He nodded. Tell her I sent you. She'll want to know the connection. What should I say our connection is? He thought about it longer than she expected. Say you're a friend of the family. It was such a careful, quiet, generous phrase for a man who clearly didn't give things away easily. She filed it away and didn't make a production of it. I'll be gone before dark, she told him. He looked at her over his coffee cup. I didn't ask for a timeline. I know. I'm giving you one anyway. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it got close, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth, a brief loosening of the jaw. She made note of it, the way you make note of small navigational markers when you're learning unfamiliar terrain. Agnes Haverford was a small, fierce woman of 63 who had the handshake of someone who'd spent decades proving she didn't need anyone's help and then had one winter break her husband's health and was now in the position of needing exactly that. She looked at Maribel for a long time before she said anything. You're the one Silas Crowley sent for, she said. Yes, ma'am. And he ran. Yes. Agnes Haverford made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a verdict. That man was a fool for 20 years before he was a coward. Should have known he'd find a way to make someone else pay for it. She looked at Maribel's hands. Can you do laundry proper or just passable? Proper, Maribel said. Good. Passable I can do myself. Proper I need help with. She opened the door wider. Come in then. I'll show you what we're dealing with. What they were dealing with was substantial. Agnes's husband, Edmund, had been bedridden for 4 months with something that had started in his legs, and the mountain of laundry that accumulated around a man who couldn't leave his bed was not small. It was also not pleasant. Maribel did not flinch, which Agnes noted. Most women flinch, Agnes said. I nursed my mother for 2 years, Maribel said. Agnes nodded once, the way people nod when a piece of information explains several other things at once. I'll pay you fair. 3 days a week. You'll start tomorrow. It was not enough to live on, but it was a start, and starts were what you needed when you were building from nothing. She found more work before the week was out, not because Hollow Ridge was generous, but because she was persistent and visible, and didn't let a closed door mean anything, except that she needed to try the next one. The physician's office, run by a Dr. Orson Vale, a man of about 70, with a slight tremor in his left hand that he'd learned to work around, needed someone to clean it 3 times a week. The dry goods store needed mending done on a consignment basis, which meant she could do it in the evenings and get paid per piece. A family called the Brennans needed someone to sit with their elderly grandmother on Saturdays while they worked. None of it was what she'd come west for. All of it was hers. She found a room to rent above the harness maker's shop cheap, with a slanted ceiling and a window that didn't quite close all the way, but it was private, and it was dry, and it was hers in the way that nothing had been hers for a while. She moved out of Gideon's spare room on the 4th day, exactly as she'd intended. Tilly cried. She did it quietly, turned toward the wall, trying not to be seen, which was somehow harsh than if she'd made noise about it. Maribel crouched down beside her. I'm not leaving Hollow Ridge, she said. I have work here. I'll be on Turner Street, above the harness maker. Tilly sniffed. That's far. It's 11 minutes on foot. I counted. You counted? I count things when I'm nervous. Tilly turned around and looked at her with wet eyes, and the particular expression of a child deciding to accept a compromise or hold out for better terms. Will you come for supper? If your father invites me. They both looked at Gideon, who was standing at the edge of the room, holding Maribel's suitcase and looking like a man who had not expected this moment to be quite as complicated as it was turning out to be. You can come for supper, he said, when you want. It wasn't an elaborate invitation, but it wasn't nothing either. The weeks of its windows were dark. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Maribel hadn't had in a long time, the particular rhythm of a life you've built yourself, with the rough edges still showing. She woke early. She worked. She ate whatever she could manage in the small hours between jobs. She did not sleep enough, and she knew it. And she did it anyway, because sleep required and stopping required. Trusting that things would hold while she wasn't watching. And she wasn't quite there yet. She went to supper at the Rourke house twice that first week, then 3 times the second. She wasn't keeping count exactly, she was, but she didn't examine it too closely. Tilly had begun bringing the plant book to the table. It was an old volume, thick, with illustrations of medicinal plants done in careful botanical detail, and she'd clearly been studying it with the dedication of a child who'd found the thing that interests her most in the world. "This one's for fever," Tilly said one evening, pointing to a drawing of yarrow. "And this one's for stomach." "Ginger's better for stomach," Maribel said, sitting beside her. "But yarrow is right for fever. Where'd you get this book?" "It was Mama's." Tilly said it the same way she always said it, plainly, without drama. She knew plants. "Papa said she could grow anything. I don't know how to grow things, but I know how to read about them." "That's where it starts," Maribel said. "Reading first, then growing." She began teaching Tilly in the gaps between supper and bedtime. It wasn't formal, more like conversation, one thing leading to another. What this plant was called. What this one did. Why you shouldn't touch that one without knowing what you had. Why some remedies helped and some were folklore, and how to tell the difference. Gideon would sit across the room during these sessions, ostensibly reading or mending something, and Maribel became aware over time that he was listening. Not intrusively, just listening, the way people listen when something is reaching them, and they haven't decided yet what to do about it. One night, after Tilly had gone to bed, he said, "You're good with her. She's easy to be good with," Maribel said, which was mostly true. "She's not easy," he said. "She's stubborn and she's got opinions about everything and she doesn't let things go." A pause. "She gets it, honestly." Maribel looked at him. It was one of the first things he'd said that was about himself rather than around himself, and it sat differently than his other words. "She told me about her mother," Maribel said carefully. He didn't tense, exactly, but something in his stillness became more deliberate. "What did she say?" "That she doesn't remember her voice, just her hands." He was quiet for a long time. The fire stove made small adjustments, and the house settled the way old wood settles in cold. He stopped. Started again. She was the kind of person who knew how to make things feel like they were going to be all right, even when they weren't. He looked at the stove instead of at Maribel. "I haven't figured out how to be that for Tilly. I'm better at fixing things you can see." "You're doing fine," Maribel said. "You don't know that." "I know, Tilly," she said. "And a child who isn't being loved right doesn't bury puppies with ceremony and argue about bedtime from a place of security. She does both of those things constantly." He looked at her then, directly, the way he didn't usually look at her without the sideways quality of someone still deciding. "You notice a lot," he said. "Occupational habit," she said. "You can't care for someone properly without paying attention to them." He nodded slowly, turned back to the stove, and they sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing she was beginning to realize about Gideon Rourke. His silences weren't empty. They had weight and texture. You could sit in them without feeling like you needed to fill them up. She left before it got too late, walking the 11 minutes back to her room above the harness shop, with the cold coming in off the plains and the stars doing their winter work overhead. She thought about what he'd said. She was the kind of person who knew how to make things feel like they were going to be all right. And she thought about how that was the very thing she had never been able to say about herself. She made things work. She did not make them feel all right. There was a difference. November came in hard that year, the kind of hard that the plains specialize in, not dramatic, not percent specialize, just a bad storm, a grinding persistent cold that settled in and made itself at home like a house guest who never asks if it's too much. The work became harder and cold. Agnes Haverford's laundry was heavier when everything was damp and slow to dry. The walk to the physician's office got longer when the wind was up. Dr. Vale noticed her one morning when she came in earlier than usual to get the stove going before he arrived. "You were up early," he said, not disapproving, just observing. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "I thought I'd make myself useful." He hung his coat and looked at her with the particular attention of an old doctor who has spent decades reading people the way other people read print. "How's your health?" "Fine," she said. "You look tired." "I am tired," she said. "That's different from unwell." He made a small sound that was somewhere between agreement and reservation. He was a good doctor, she'd determined that within the first week of working for him. His hands were steadier than his age should have allowed, except for the left one, and he'd learned to compensate with a precision that came only from decades of adjusting. He was also, she thought, lonely in the way of old men who've outlived most of their peers and have more knowledge than they have anyone left to give it to. One afternoon, she was restocking his supply shelf when he came in from a call and sat down heavily in his chair. "Briggs' boy has croup," he said, more to himself than to her. Mother's half out of her mind with worry. Father's worse than useless, can't look at a sick child without going pale. "Steam helps with croup," Maribel said. "If you get the room humid enough. My mother used a kettle when I was small." He looked at her. "You mentioned nursing your mother. 2 years. She had a lung condition. Long, slow progression. She kept stacking the shelf. I learned what I could because there wasn't much else to be done, and doing nothing was worse." "What did you learn?" she told him. Plainly, without embellishment, what had worked, what hadn't, what she'd figured out by trial and error, and what she'd found in books. He listened with the quality of attention he gave to everything, which was complete. "You have a medical mind," he said when she finished. "I have a practical mind," she said. "I'm not sure they're the same thing. In my experience, they're closer than medical school likes to admit." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that measuring expression. "Would you be interested in learning more?" Formally. "As much as I can teach." She turned to look at him directly. "You're asking if I want to apprentice with you. I'm asking if you want to learn medicine from a 70-year-old man with a tremor in his left hand who has approximately 15 to 20 useful years left and nobody to pass any of this to." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, which she recognized as her own conversational style reflected back at her. But apprentice is a fine word for it. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Good. We'll start with what you already know, and work forward from there. You'll still clean the office. I can't pay you more yet." "I didn't ask for more," she said. "I know." He picked up his pen. "That's why I'll find a way to eventually." That was the second Thursday of November, and it was the moment, though she didn't recognize it as such until much later, when Maribel Wren stopped simply surviving in Hollow Ridge and began actually living in it. She told Tilly that evening, partly because Tilly would want to know, and partly because she discovered that telling Tilly things was a reliable way of organizing them in her own mind. Tilly's reaction was immediate and physical. She grabbed Maribel's arm with both hands and said, "I knew it," with a volume and conviction that suggested she had in fact known no such thing, but had decided retroactively that she had. "You can teach me too," Tilly said. "You're 6, Gideon said from the kitchen doorway. Tilly said. "So," he said, and then stopped, because there was no strong argument against a 6-year-old learning plant medicine that didn't sound foolish when you said it aloud. Maribel covered her mouth with her hand, in a way that wasn't entirely about thinking. Gideon looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them, not yet defined, not yet named, but present enough that she felt it the way you feel a change in the air pressure before a storm. Not threatening, just different from before. Then the moment moved on, the way moments do. Tilly was still talking about what she would learn first, and Gideon turned back to whatever he was making for supper, and the gray cat came in from the cold and settled by the stove, with the satisfied air of an animal that has arranged the world exactly to its liking. 3 weeks later, the storm came. Not the metaphorical kind, the real kind, the plains variety, the sort that starts in the middle of the night and by morning has rearranged your understanding of how much wind can actually exist. Maribel was caught on the road between Agnes Haverford's house and her room when it turned from bad to dangerous. The water in the low point of the road had risen fast, the way it does when the ground is already frozen and has nowhere to send the rain, and she was wading through it, suitcase held up with both arms, water at her knees, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Gideon pulled up beside her with a face that had the particular expression of a man who has done the calculation and found it went only one direction. "Get on," he said. Maribel, he said her name the way he said most things without decoration, without negotiation room. "Get on the horse." She got on the horse. He brought her back to the ranch because it was closer than her room, and the road between was worse. He didn't make a fuss about it, and she didn't either, which seemed to be the native language between them. He gave her dry clothes that had been his wife's, packed in a trunk, offered without comment, and received the same way. She changed in the sewing room, her room, for that one night, and came out to find him standing at the kitchen stove with his back to her, making coffee, and Tilly asleep on the settee with the plant book open across her chest. She waited up, he said, without turning around. Worried. About me? He turned and handed her the coffee. He had the slightly damp, wind-blown look of someone who'd been out in weather, and there was a cut on the side of his left hand from something fence wire, probably, or the saddle hardware. Without thinking, she set her cup down and reached for his hand. He went very still. She examined the cut, not deep, but dirty. She went to the supply cupboard, because she'd learned where things were in this kitchen, the way you learn things you return to often. And she cleaned the cut and closed it with 2 pieces of clean linen tied tight. He watched her do it without saying anything. You should be more careful with fence wire, she said. I usually am, he said. I was in a hurry. She looked up. He was closer than she'd realized. The kitchen wasn't large, and they'd both been focused on the hand. She could see the tiredness in his face clearly, and underneath it, the thing that lived beneath all his expressions, that particular grief that hadn't finished with him. Yet, that probably never entirely would. She stepped back and picked up her coffee. Thank you, she said, for coming out in that weather. He looked at her for a moment. You'd have been waist deep in 20 minutes, I know. She wrapped both hands around the cup. I was trying to decide whether pride or pragmatism would win. Which was ahead? Pragmatism narrowly, she said. But it was close. He almost smiled again. This time it made it further a small, genuine thing, there and gone. She stored it away with the others. Outside, the storm was doing whatever it intended to do about the plains, loud and cold and entirely indifferent to the small warmths inside particular houses. The fire crackled. Tilly breathed evenly on the settee. The gray cat had materialized from somewhere and was sitting in the exact center and floor of the kitchen floor, looking at no one. Maribel thought, I did not expect this, any of this. She thought, that doesn't mean it's wrong. She drank her coffee and let the warmth of the house settle into her bones, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she didn't feel the need to count anything. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind the particular kind of stillness that only comes after something loud and violent has spent itself completely. The road dried enough by midday that Maribel could walk back to her room above the harness shop, and she did with dry clothes folded under her arm, and the cut on Gideon's hand still on her mind, in the way that small things stay with you when you haven't decided what to make of them yet. December settled in behind the storm like it had been waiting for the opening. The cold became a permanent condition rather than a weather event, and Hollow Ridge contracted the way frontier towns contract in winter. People stayed closer to their stoves, traveled less, visited less, and the social life of the place slowed to the particular pace of people conserving energy for the long months ahead. Maribel's days filled themselves. She had that talent, the ability to find the shape of available work and fit herself into it without waste. Agnes Haverford's laundry doctor, Vale's office, which had become something more than cleaning by December. She was sitting in on his patient consultations with his permission, taking notes in the small, precise handwriting she'd developed, while tracking her mother's medications. Most of its windows were dark, asking questions after the patients left that he answered with the thoroughness of a man who'd been waiting for someone worth answering. The mending work from the dry goods store. Saturdays with the Brennan grandmother, who was sharp-minded and needed conversation more than nursing. Most of its windows were dark, and who told Maribel stories about crossing the country 30 years ago that were so vivid they sometimes woke her in the night, still hearing the old woman's voice. She went to the Rourke house for supper 3 times a week. That had become the rhythm without anyone formally declaring it. Tilly expected her and planned for it. She'd started saving questions from her plant book. For those evenings, a small stack of them she'd been sitting on through the day, the way children save things that are too good to use up alone. Gideon had stopped apologizing for the invitations. That was progress of a kind. One evening in early December, Maribel arrived to find Tess sitting on the porch steps in the cold without a coat, arms wrapped around her knees, looking at nothing. "What are you doing out here?" Maribel said. "Thinking," Tilly said. "Without a coat? I forgot the coat part." Maribel went inside, got the coat from the hook by the door, came back out and put it around Tilly's shoulders without comment. She sat down beside her on the steps. which were cold enough to be immediately uncomfortable, and looked out at whatever Tilly was looking at, which turned out to be the sky, doing something complicated with clouds. After a minute, Tilly said, "Some of the kids at church said you're not actually my mama." Maribel was quiet. "I know you're not," Tilly said. "I'm not stupid. I know what actually is." She pulled the coat tighter. "But I told them that didn't matter because you act like one, and that's the part that counts." Maribel looked at the side of Tilly's face. "Then some of them said there some mamas said it was disgraceful. You coming to our house all the time without being married." Tilly's voice had gone carefully flat, the way children make their voices flat when they're repeating something that hurt them and are trying to keep the hurt from showing. "And Mrs. Harlow said you were probably after Papa's money, except I wanted to say Papa doesn't have that much money, so that didn't even make sense." "Tilly, I didn't say it," she said. "I just thought it very hard in her direction." Despite everything, Maribel almost smiled. "What did you say?" "Nothing." A pause. I came home. Inside, through the kitchen window, they could see Gideon moving around the stove. He hadn't seen them yet. "Do you want to know what I think?" Maribel said. Tilly looked at her. "People say things because it makes them feel safer," Maribel said. "If they can put a name to something that confuses them, call it disgraceful or suspicious or makes it small enough to dismiss us, then they don't have to then they don't have to think about it anymore. It's not kind, but it's human." She adjusted the coat more firmly around Tilly's shoulders. "And none of it changes what actually happens in that kitchen." Tilly considered this for a moment, with the seriousness she brought to most things. "What does happen in that kitchen?" "We eat," Maribel said. "We talk. You ask me 12 questions about plants, and I answer 10 of them and make up answers for the other 2. Tilly's mouth twitched. "You don't make them up." "Once I did. The one about willow bark and headaches." "You made that up?" "No," Maribel said. "That one was real. I was testing whether you were paying attention." Tilly stared at her for a second, and then made a sound that was genuinely a laugh surprised out of her, the best kind. She leaned slightly sideways, and pressed against Maribel's arm, without ceremony, just placing herself there like it was a decision that required no announcement. Maribel did not make a production of it. She just let it be. Behind them, the door opened. Gideon leaned out, saw them both on the steps, took in the situation with the rapid assessment of a man accustomed to arriving in the middle of things. "Supper's ready," he said. "Why are you sitting on the cold steps?" "Thinking," Tilly said. He looked at Maribel. She gave him a small, level look that said, "I'll tell you later, or maybe I won't. But either way, it's handled." He seemed to understand this. He was getting better at reading her, which she'd noticed and wasn't sure what to do with. "Inside," he said. "Both of you," they went inside. It was mid-December when the first child got sick. Maribel heard about it through Dr. Vale, who mentioned it at the end of a long Tuesday, with the slightly careful tone of a man who doesn't want to be alarmist, but is thinking about the shape of something. "Ingrid Moss's youngest," he said. "High fever came on fast. Could be anything winter brings all manner of it. But the mother says 2 other children on the same road had fevers last week that passed." "Did you see those children?" Maribel asked. "Only one. The other 2 recovered before anyone called me." He was cleaning his instruments with the methodical thoroughness that was as much habit as hygiene. "I'll check on the Moss boy tomorrow." "What were the symptoms?" She had her notebook. She'd started keeping one for her time with Vale, a plain-covered thing she'd bought at the dry goods store, and filled with observations and questions and remedies and his answers to both. The other 2 children. Fever high and fast, some throat involvement, fatigue that lasted longer than the fever itself. He set down the instrument. "I'm not saying it's connected, but you're not saying it isn't." He looked at her over his spectacles in the way he did when she'd said the precise thing he'd been thinking. "Keep your eyes open," he said. "When you're at the Haverford house, the Brennan house, if you hear of anything similar, tell me." She heard of something similar within the week. Agnes Haverford mentioned in passing that the Greer family's daughter had been sick. Then the harness maker's wife, who rented Maribel her room, mentioned that 2 children from the family across the road had been running fevers since Sunday. Then on Saturday, the Brennan grandmother told her that she'd heard from her daughter-in-law that the Miller boys were sick, both of them, and the doctor had been out twice. Maribel went straight to Vale's office after the Brennans. He was already there, coat still on, looking at the map of Hollow Ridge he kept on his wall, one of those hand-drawn things. Not entirely accurate, but good enough to know where everyone lived relative to each other. He'd been marking it. Small penciled dots, 4 of them. And when Maribel came in and told him about the Greer girl and the children across from the harness shop, he made 2 more. They both stood there looking at the dots. That's not random, Maribel said. No, he said, it's not. They're all within walking distance of the same water source. She looked at the map more carefully. The well at the north end of Clement Street. Everyone in that radius draws from it. Vale looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he'd been afraid to confirm. I thought of that this morning, he said. I didn't want to, he stopped. Didn't want to be wrong, she said. Didn't want to be right. He turned from the map. If the water's involved, this is going to spread faster than it already has. Anyone who used it in the last 2 weeks could be incubating. What do we do? He sat down. She'd never seen him sit down in the middle of a conversation before he was a pacer, a man who thought better upright. The sitting told her something about how serious this was. I send word to close the well. Today he picked up his pen. And then we go see every family in that radius and find out who's sick and who isn't and who's been in contact with whom. He looked up. I need help, Maribel. I can't cover this alone, I know, she said. Tell me where to start. They argued briefly about what she should tell the families. Vale was cautious. He didn't want to create panic. And he was also a man of a certain generation who worried about prescience of the appearance of a woman of ambiguous standing making medical pronouncements in people's homes. They'll take it better from me, he said, not dismissively, practically. Some of them will, Maribel agreed. And some of them have already told me more than they'd tell you, because I'm the woman who does their laundry, and the woman who sits with their grandmother, and I have a face they've seen every week for 2 months. She kept her voice even. You can't afford to send me home on principle right now. There are too many houses. He looked at her for a long moment. You're right, he said. But if anyone objects to your presence, you step back. No arguments. Agreed. She went out that afternoon into the cold with a list of addresses and the particular calm of someone who knows they're going to see difficult things and has already accepted that and moved past it. She knocked on doors. She asked questions carefully in the language of concern rather than alarm. She noted symptoms, durations, severity. She talked to mothers who were frightened and fathers who were defensive and children who were burning up and didn't understand why. She was at it until dark. By the time she got back to Vale's office to compile what she'd found, her feet were numb and her throat hurt from the cold air. And she had 6 pages of notes and a clear picture of something that was considerably worse than she'd hoped. 11 children. 11 confirmed or likely cases within the Clement Street radius. Ages ranging from 2 to 9. 3 of them had been sick and recovered or seemed to have. 8 were currently febrile, 3 of those badly enough to concern her. And 2 more families she'd visited had children who were showing early signs that she recognized now, the particular lethargy, the complaint of throat pain, the flushed face that wasn't yet a full fever but was heading there. Vale looked at her notes in silence for a long time. The well is closed, he said. I had it done this afternoon. It may be too late for that to matter to the ones already exposed, she said. I know, he set the notes down. He looked tired in a way that went past one day. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Yes. She said it without softening it, because he didn't need softening. He needed honesty. What does the treatment look like? Keep the fever manageable. Hydration is critical. If they stop drinking, they deteriorate fast. He stood and moved to his medicine shelf, not reaching for anything, just looking. I have willow bark. I have some quinine, not much. Need to save that for the worst cases. I have fever reducers, nothing that addresses the underlying cause directly. He paused. The parents need to know what to watch for through the night. If a fever spikes past a certain point in a child that small, I can show them, Maribel said. What to watch for. How to cool them, how to keep them drinking. I can write it out simply enough that a frightened parent can follow it at 2 in the morning when they're too scared to think clearly. He looked at her. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite surprise either. He'd known that for weeks. It was more like a formal acknowledgement, the kind that closes the distance between what has been implied and what has been said plainly. I know enough, she said. I'm not you, but I know enough. Then you'll work beside me on this, he said. Not for me. Beside me, she nodded once. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow will be long. She walked home in the dark and lay down without undressing, and closed her eyes and not sleep for a long time. She thought about 11 children and 2 more who were probably going to make 13 before morning. She thought about what her mother had looked like in the worst of it, the fever glaze in her eyes, the way breathing changed when things were getting serious, the particular weight of watching someone you love and not being able to do enough. She knew that weight. She was about to carry it for strangers. That was the thing about this kind of work, she thought. You couldn't hold yourself separate from it and still do it right. You had to let it matter. The people who kept themselves too carefully detached, she'd seen it. Even in the short time she'd been working with Vale, they were precise, but they were missing something. Medicine wasn't only knowledge. It was sustained, deliberate caring, the kind that costs you something, and the cost was the price of being any use at all. She slept eventually. A few hours. Enough. The next week was the hardest she'd had since her mother's worst winter. She moved from house to house with Vale, then without him when they had to split up to cover the ground, and she did the things she knew how to do. She cooled fevers with damp cloths and cold water, patiently, repeatedly, for hours at a time. She forced water and weak broth into children who didn't want to swallow it, one small spoonful at a time, the way her mother had once forced it into her when she was small and sick. She showed mothers how to read the quality of a fever, when it was manageable, when it was crossing a line, what to do in the crossing. She sat up through several nights in houses that weren't hers with families she barely knew and watched small bodies fight through something difficult and tried to make sure they had what they needed to win. Most of its windows were dark. The same women who had stood on the platforms opened their doors to her now without hesitation. She noticed this. She did not make anything of it, not resentment, not satisfaction. It was simply information. People were predictable in specific ways. They judged what they could afford to judge and stopped when they couldn't. She did not hold the earlier cruelty against them, but she didn't forgive it quite yet either. There was a middle space she occupied, practical and clear-eyed, doing the work without requiring them to be different than they were. Mrs. Harlow, the woman who had told Tilly it was disgraceful. Maribel, coming to the Rourke house all the time, opened her door on the 4th day with a face stripped of all its yochun. Her youngest, a boy of 4, had spiked a fever overnight that had his father pacing the hall in help circles. I didn't know who else Mrs. Harlow started. I know, Maribel said. Let me see him. She spent 4 hours there. The boy's fever was high, but not yet at the point Vale had marked as the most dangerous. She cooled him steadily and showed Mrs. Harlow how to continue it, sat with her until the fever broke enough to give them breathing room, and then talked her through the night instructions twice until she was sure the woman had them. Mrs. Harlow held her hand at the door when she left. I said things, she said. Her voice was strange, stripped of the social performance she usually wore it with. Just a woman at a door, tired and frightened and aware of something she'd gotten wrong. About you, I said things I shouldn't have. Maribel looked at her. I know what you said. I'm sorry. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't enough to cover everything. And Maribel knew it would probably be only partially permanent, that Mrs. Harlow might revert to some version of her former self once the crisis had passed and the habit of judgment reasserted itself. People often did. But the apology was real in this moment, and Maribel had learned enough about people to know that real moments, even partial ones, were worth something. Take care of him tonight, she said. That's what matters. She walked down the steps and kept going. She was tired in a way she hadn't been since the last terrible week of her mother's life. Not broken, she'd never been particularly prone to breaking, but scraped thin, running on something that was past adrenaline and past will, and was more like a kind of deep, canonical stubbornness she'd apparently always had and hadn't known the shape of until now. She was 2 streets from home when she heard hoofbeats. She knew them by now. The particular cadence of Gideon's horse, slightly uneven on the left front, a thing he was going to need to address with the farrier soon. She'd mentioned it once, and he'd looked at her with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being told things about his horse by someone who'd been in town for 2 months, but couldn't argue because she was right. He pulled up beside her. He looked at her face in the dark, with the particular focused attention he gave to things he was genuinely concerned about. You look terrible, he said. Thank you, she said. It's been a long week, I know. He dismounted. fell into step beside her, leading the horse. How many? 13 confirmed. 2 more that will probably be by morning. She pulled her coat tighter. We've got most of them stable. There are 3 I'm not certain about yet. He walked beside her, without saying anything for a moment. This was something she'd come to understand about him, that he processed difficult information in real time rather than responding immediately, and that the silence was thinking rather than absence. Tilly, she started. She's fine, he said. I've been keeping her away from town. Away from other children. He glanced at her. I know what you've been doing. Vale told me. You spoke with Dr. Vale. I brought him firewood. He's been working out of that cold office for a week, and his supply was low. He said it simply without presenting it as anything. Just a thing that needed doing that he'd done. That was kind, she said. Don't make it large, he said. It was firewood. She almost smiled. It was a thin smile given how tired she was, but it was present. They reached the harness shop. She stopped at the base of her stairs. Go home, Gideon. It's late and cold, and you have animals that need you in the morning. Are you eating? He said. The question caught her off guard, which was unusual. Most questions didn't. When I have time, she said. That means no. He reached into the saddlebag and produced a wrapped cloth. She could feel the warmth of it from where she stood. Agnes Haverford sent that. She said you looked thin when you came by yesterday, and she wasn't sure you were keeping yourself fed. Most of its windows were dark. Maribel took the wrapped cloth. It was heavier than she expected, Bredge thought, and something else. Something with enough substance to be a real meal. Her throat did something unexpected, and she held very still until it passed. Tell her thank you, she said. You can tell her yourself. She'd like to hear it. He remounted. Get some sleep tonight, Maribel. I'm going to try. He looked at her from the horse for a moment, that direct look, the one without the sideways quality. Then he turned the horse and rode back toward the edge of town, the uneven hoof-fall fading into the cold dark. She ate the food from Agnes Haverford, sitting on the edge of her bed with her coat still on, and the candle burning low, and the plains wind doing its cold, indifferent work outside her window. The bread was good. The rest was a bean stew with enough salt and enough body to be exactly what she needed, which made her think Agnes Haverford had been paying more attention to her than she'd realized. She was 3 bites in when the knock came, soft, but urgent, the particular urgent that doesn't want to be heard by anyone except the person it's meant for. She went to the door. The man standing there was one of Gideon's ranch hands. She'd seen him in town a few times, a young man named Pete who was generally quiet and generally unhurried. He was neither of those things now. Miss Wren, he said. Mr. Rourke sent me back. The young man stopped, and she could see something uncomfortable in his face, the thing people look like when they're carrying bad news they don't want to deliver. It's Tilly. She started with a fever about an hour after he left. He says it came on fast. Maribel moved before the sentence was fully finished. She grabbed her bag, the one she'd assembled over the last week, with the things she now knew she needed, organized the way her notebook was organized, the way her mind worked, and she was down the stairs and into the cold before Pete had fully turned around. Can you ride double? He said. Yes, she said. She'd never in her life ridden double, but this was not the moment to examine that particular gap in her experience. They rode. The ranch was dark except for one window, and that one window was the kind of brightness that comes from too many candles lit by someone who needed to see clearly and was past worrying about the cost of them. She was inside before Pete had finished tying the horse. Gideon was in the doorway to Tilly's room. He turned when he heard her come in, and she saw something she hadn't seen on his face before, the thing underneath all the reserve, all the careful practical competence. Fear. Clean and direct and entirely unguarded, the way fear looks on a person who doesn't usually let anything show. She was fine when I left, he said. His voice was level, but the level was costing him. I was gone 2 hours. That's how it's moving, she said, already past him and into the room. Fast onset. It's not your fault. Tilly was in her bed, the quilt pulled up to her chin, her face flushed the deep overheated pink that Maribel had now seen on 13 other children and had learned to read like a language she'd never wanted to speak. Her eyes were open but glassy, that particular unfocused quality that meant the fever had been building for longer than an hour, regardless of when anyone noticed it. Hey, Maribel said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Tilly's eyes moved to her. Something shifted in them, recognition, and then a complicated kind of relief that broke something open in Maribel's chest that she immediately closed back down, because this was not the time. "You came," Tilly said. Her voice was hoarse. "I came," Maribel said. She put her hand to the girl's forehead. Hot, very hot. But she'd seen hotter, and the children had come through. "Does your throat hurt?" "Yes." "Your head?" "Some." "Okay." She looked at Gideon in the doorway. "I need cool water, not cold, cool and clean cloths. And the broth, if you have any made." "I have broth," he said. He didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, just turned and went. Good, she thought. That was important, a parent who could act while frightened rather than freezing. It made everything easier. She worked steadily through the next hour, doing what she'd done in 13 other houses. Cool cloths on Tilly's forehead, the back of her neck, her wrists. Small sips of broth, patient and repeated. Talking low and calm, not about the fever, about other things. The plant book. Bucket the horse and his opinions. The gray cat and where it kept disappearing to. The puppies with the flat rock markers. Whatever kept Tilly's mind engaged enough to stay present and not drift into the feverish half-consciousness that she'd seen in the worst of the sick children. Tilly held her hand, not grabbed it the way she sometimes did urgently, the way she'd grabbed it on the platform. Just held it, loosely, the way people hold on to something when they're not sure of their footing, and they don't want to make a fuss about it. Gideon brought water and broth, and then sat in the corner of the room, out of the way, watching. He was not the kind of man who fell apart in a crisis. He was the kind who went very still instead, all his energy pulled inward and focused. She'd noticed this about him in smaller situations and was noticing it again now, scaled up. Midnight came and went. Tilly's fever peaked sometime around 1 in the morning. Maribel felt it in the temperature under her palm, that particular crest where the body has pushed everything it has into fighting and is either going to win or not. She increased the cooling. She kept talking. She watched Tilly's breathing with the close attention she'd been trained into over weeks of standing beside Vale in examination rooms, the rhythm, the depth, the quality. Gideon asked once, "From the corner? She's fighting?" Maribel said. "That's what this looks like. She's doing what she's supposed to do." He was quiet. "Talk to her," Maribel said. "What?" "She can hear you. Talk to her." She kept her eyes on Tilly. "She knows your voice. It'll help her stay anchored." A pause. Then, in a voice lower than she'd ever heard from him, rougher at the edges, Gideon Rourke began talking to his daughter. About the ranch, the things that needed doing in spring, the fence on the east side he'd been putting off. About Bucket and how the horse had developed a preference for one particular patch of grass that made no apparent sense. About the way the light came through the barn in the early morning, which he knew she'd noticed because she'd mentioned it once, and he'd been thinking about it since. He talked like someone who wasn't used to talking this much and was doing it anyway because she needed it, and the discomfort of it was entirely secondary to that need. Tilly's hand tightened slightly around Maribel's. The fever crested and began very slowly to pull back. By 3 in the morning, it had dropped enough that Maribel could breathe differently. By 4, it was clear that the worst had passed, not finished. Fevers never finished neatly. There would be the next day and probably the day after, a fatigue and sore throat and careful watching, but the dangerous window was closing. Sometime just before dawn, Tilly's opened clearer than they'd been all night. She looked at Maribel. "Mama," she said. Her voice was barely there, still hoarse and thin. "You stayed." Maribel was very still. She had not let herself react to Tilly, calling her that not on the platform, not in the various conversations since. She had understood it for what it was, the vocabulary of a child's longing, the way grief reaches for the shape it's missing. She had been careful with it, careful not to let it mean more than she could sustain. But at 4 in the morning, after a night of sitting at the edge of a sick child's bed, with her hand held and her name spoken in a voice that made no distinction between earned and given at 4 in the morning, with the fever broken and the dark lifting and the planes going. Quiet outside the window, the careful distance she'd maintained around. That word simply wasn't there anymore. "Of course I stayed," she said. Her voice was steady. Everything else was not. Gideon stood up from the corner. He crossed the room and looked at his daughter, and then he looked at Maribel, and the thing in his face was not fear anymore. It was something else entirely, something that had no careful name and didn't need one. Tilly had already fallen back into genuine sleep, the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a body that has done hard work and is now resting. Her hand had gone loose, but Maribel didn't move hers away. She sat there in the dark and the quiet, and she let herself be, for just this moment, exactly what she was. Not the woman who'd been abandoned on a platform. Not the mail-order bride the town had laughed at. Not the stranger who'd been taken in out of obligation and a child's stubbornness. The woman who had stayed. There was a long difference between those things. And she had spent the last several months covering that ground one day at a time, without letting herself look up and see how far she'd come. Dawn began to show itself at the edge of the window, the particular gray-pink of Plains dawn that was nothing like dawn anywhere else, wide and cold and honest about its size. The fire in the small stove in the corner had burned low, and the room had the particular stillness of somewhere that has been through something and come out the other side. Gideon brought 2 cups of coffee at some point, she didn't know exactly when, and set one beside her without saying anything. He sat down in the chair he'd pulled close sometime in the last hour. He drank his coffee and looked at his daughter, sleeping, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I didn't know if she would." "I know," Maribel said. "I didn't know what I would do if—" "I know?" She looked at him. His face in the early morning light was open in a way she hadn't seen before, the reserve worn through by a night of sustained fear and relief. He looked younger and older at the same time, which was what honesty did to faces. "She's going to be all right, Gideon." He looked at her. Something in his expression asked more than that, though not in words, something about the whole of this woman in his daughter's room at dawn, with the fever, broken, this thing that had been accumulating for months without a name, this life that looked nothing like he'd planned, and considerably more like something he might not want to give back. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't built to say it yet. But he looked at her, and she looked back, and Tilly breathed evenly between them, and outside the window, Hollow Ridge moved into its cold December morning entirely indifferent to the fact that something had shifted in the room above the ranch. The coffee was strong and slightly too hot, and she drank it anyway, both hands around the cup, watching the light change. Tilly recovered slowly, the way children recover from serious fevers, not all at once, but in installments, a little more herself each morning, a little less glassy-eyed, a little more interested in the plant book and the cat, and whether Bucket had been properly exercised while she was confined to bed. By the 4th day, she was sitting up and arguing about whether she was well enough to go outside, which Gideon took as the clearest possible sign that she was going to be fine. Maribel stayed at the ranch for 3 of those 4 days. She told herself it was medical necessity, which was partially true the first 72 hours after that required monitoring, and she was the one who knew what to monitor. She told herself it was practical, which was also partially true. The weather had turned again, and the road back to her room was miserable, and she had nowhere urgent to be. What she did not examine closely was how little she wanted to leave. She slept in the sewing room again. She woke early and made coffee. She checked on Tilly, helped Gideon with the morning feeding twice when he was behind on other ranch work and too proud to ask, cooked 3 meals that were better than what he'd have made, and spent her evenings sitting with Tilly going through the plant book, with the slow pleasure of 2 people doing something they both genuinely enjoyed. On the 3rd evening, when Tilly had finally fallen asleep at a reasonable hour from actual tiredness rather than fever, Maribel sat across from Gideon at the kitchen table, and they drank coffee in the particular silence that had become their natural resting state, not empty, not avoiding anything, just 2 people who had gotten comfortable enough to stop performing. "You don't have to stay," he said, not unkindly, more like he was checking something. "I know," she said. "The road's clear enough now." "I know that too." He looked at his cup. He stopped. "Because I'm not finished making sure she's all right," Maribel said, which was true, and was also not the whole of it, and they both knew that. He didn't push it. He refilled her coffee without being asked and went back to the account book he'd been working on, which she suspected balanced worse than he wanted to let on, based on the way his jaw set when he looked at certain pages. She went back to her room the next morning. She walked the 11 minutes in the cold with her broken-handled suitcase and the particular feeling of someone returning to a place they've been away from long enough that it requires re-inhabiting. The room above the harness shop was cold from disuse, the window that didn't close properly having let in a persistent draft, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment, just taking stock. It was hers. Small and cold and imperfect and hers. She built the fire and unpacked and got on with it. The epidemic, as Hollow Ridge would come to call it, burned through its worst in the 2 weeks following Tilly's illness, then began to subside the way these things did not cleanly. Not all at once, but in the gradual diminishing of new cases and the recovery of existing ones, until Vale and Maribel could stand in his office and look at their notes and determine that the crisis had turned a corner. 15 children in total. 15 families who had spent some portion of December in the particular terror of watching a child fight a high fever through the long nights. All 15 had come through it. One little boy, the Greer girl's brother, 4 years old, Hunines, who had been the worst of the serious cases, had given them 3 days of genuine doubt before his fever broke on the 4th morning, and Maribel had spent most of those 3 days in that house, sleeping in a chair beside his bed in 2-hour increments. He was fine now. He'd been running around his yard since last Tuesday, his mother had told her, as if nothing had happened. That was the thing about children. They bounced. Doctor. Vale called a meeting of the town's community members in the 2nd week of January, not an official thing, just the gathering that frontier towns called when something significant had happened and people needed to talk about it. Maribel didn't expect to be invited. She'd been operating in the way she generally operated, doing the work and not making herself the center of the story around it. Vale sent for her specifically. In writing, on his official letterhead, which was slightly yellowed at the edges, but still commanded a certain weight. She came to the meeting and sat in the 3rd row next to Agnes Haverford, who had inserted herself beside Maribel with the decisive physicality of a woman staking a claim. Vale stood at the front of the room and talked about the epidemic, what had caused it, how it had spread, how it had been managed, and what the town should do differently going forward regarding the Clement Street well and water management more broadly. He was precise and clear and gave credit where he gave it. He said her name 4 times. Not as background, not as the woman who'd helped out. He said, Maribel Wren assessed these families. Maribel Wren developed the symptom tracking system. Maribel Wren stayed 3 nights in the Greer house. Maribel Wren has been working alongside me for 2 months, and there are children alive in this room today, in part because of her knowledge and her willingness to put herself where she was needed. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Agnes Haverford started clapping. She did it deliberately, like someone making a point, and it was slightly too loud and slightly too sustained for the room and entirely intentional. A few others joined, then more. It was not a standing ovation. This was a frontier town meeting in January, not a theater, but it was real, which was worth more. Maribel sat very still with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and felt something in her chest move around uncomfortably. The way things move when you've been braced for impact for so long that the absence of it is its own kind of shock. Mrs. Harlow was in the 4th row. She clapped too. She didn't look at Maribel directly, which Maribel took as evidence that the apology on the doorstep had cost the woman something, and she wasn't quite finished paying for it, which was fine. Maribel didn't need her to look. Afterward, several people came to speak to her. Fathers who shook her hand too firmly. Mothers who held on to her arm while they talked. The Greer boy's mother, who didn't say anything at all, just held both of Maribel's hands for a moment and looked at her. And that was enough. Vale found her on the way out. Beginning of the month, he said, I'm changing the arrangement. You'll be on salary. Dr. Vale, you don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said in the way he said things when he'd already finished an argument with himself, and wasn't interested in starting another one. I've been thinking about this for weeks. Wax. I won't practice forever, and someone needs to know this town and its people and its particular problems well enough to take over what I've built. That requires planning. He looked at her over his spectacles. Unless you've changed your mind about staying. She hadn't changed her mind about staying. She'd barreled herself, making the final decision, which was how she knew it had been for real. The things you stop questioning are the things you've actually chosen. I haven't changed my mind, she said. Good. He put on his hat. You also need to see about replacing that suitcase. The handle's been broken since October. It's an embarrassment at this point. She laughed. It surprised her, the fullness of it, coming from somewhere that hadn't been used in a while. Vale walked away looking satisfied with himself. January turned to February, and February was when the trouble came. Not the epidemic kind, the social kind, which was in some ways harder to manage, because it didn't have a clear clinical presentation and couldn't be treated with willow bark and patience. It started as these things usually started, with whispers. Maribel had been in enough small communities to recognize the whisper stage, the conversations that stopped when she walked in, the particular quality of certain glances, the way information traveled in patterns that had nothing to do with what was actually true. The content of the whispers, when she assembled it from the fragments she caught, and the things people told her directly, was this: an unmarried woman of 31, with no family in town, was spending considerable time at a widower's ranch, had in fact stayed there for 3 days during the epidemic. And while of course her medical work was all very admirable, there were questions, weren't there, about the nature of the arrangement and whether it was entirely appropriate and what kind of example it set for the children of Hollow Ridge. She heard it first from Tilly, in the blunt, second-hand way that children report things they've overheard. Someone said, "You're a bad influence." "Who said that?" "Mrs. Clement." "I wasn't supposed to hear it. I was around the corner." Maribel absorbed this. "What do you think?" she asked Tilly. Tilly looked at her with the expression of someone who finds the question mildly insulting. "I think Mrs. Clement's husband ran off with a woman from the next county, and she's been angry about it ever since. So she's not really a good judge of character." Maribel pressed her lips together. "Where did you hear that?" "Around the corner from various conversations," Tilly said. "I'm very good at corners." The second time she heard it was more direct. A woman named Dorothy Pressfield, who served on the town's informal moral committee, a thing that no frontier town ever officially organized, but every frontier town had came into Vale's office one morning when she knew he was out and stood in front of Maribel with the expression of someone who has been elected to say something unpleasant and is trying to get it over with. "I'm going to speak plainly," Dorothy Pressfield said. "Please do," Maribel said. She was restocking a shelf. She kept restocking it. "There is concern in the community about the time you spend at the Rourke property." "I'm aware." "A woman in your position—" Dorothy stopped, apparently deciding something about the word position. "An unmarried woman making regular visits to an unmarried man's home invites a particular kind of speculation." "I'm sure you understand." "I do understand," Maribel said. "What would you like me to do about it?" Dorothy blinked. She'd apparently expected a different kind of response, more defensive, or more apologetic. The calm question seemed to throw her slightly. "Well, fewer visits, perhaps. Or visits with appropriate—" "I'm Tilly Rourke's teacher," Maribel said. She turned from the shelf and faced Dorothy directly, which she'd found was usually the right strategy. People who came prepared to be uncomfortable expected you to share that discomfort, and not sharing it put them at a disadvantage. "I'm also her primary medical contact, as she was recently ill with the same fever that affected 15 other children in this town. And I am a professional working under Dr. Vale's supervision. I visit many homes in Hollow Ridge, including homes with men in them, because that is what my work requires." She kept her voice even and clear. "I'm not going to stop doing my work because it makes someone uncomfortable." Dorothy's expression did several things in rapid succession. "The concern is about appearances." "I know what the concern is about," Maribel said. "And I'd like to ask you something, Mrs. Pressfield, plainly, since we're being plain." She set down what she was holding. "When I was working through the epidemic, when I was the woman knocking on doors at midnight, because, Doctor, Vale couldn't be in 2 places at once, was there concern about my appearances then?" Dorothy was quiet. "Because if the same presence that saved children in December is now a scandal in February, I'd like to understand the distinction." "I think that's a fair question." A long pause. Dorothy Pressfield was not, Maribel had concluded, a stupid woman. She was a woman who had internalized a particular set of rules about how things should look, and was now standing in a room with someone who had exposed those rules as inconsistent, which was its own kind of discomfort. "I'll convey your perspective," Dorothy said. "I appreciate that," Maribel said, and then she turned back to the shelf. She waited until she heard the office door close before she stopped what she was doing and stood still for a moment with her hands on the shelf edge and breathed carefully. She was not as unaffected as she'd looked. She never was. But there was a significant difference between being affected and being moved, and she'd learned over 31 years that holding your ground in the moment was almost always the right call, and the falling apart, if it was going to happen, could happen later in private. It happened a little that evening in the form of sitting on her bed for 20 minutes doing nothing, which, for Maribel, was the equivalent of someone else breaking dishes. Then she got up and went to the Rourke house for supper. Gideon opened the door and looked at her face with that rapid assessment he'd gotten very good at. "What happened?" he said. "I'll tell you after Tilly's in bed," she said. He nodded and let her in and didn't ask again. Supper was beans and cornbread, and something he'd done to a piece of salt pork that was better than the ingredients suggested it should be. Tilly talked about Bucket, and a bird she'd seen from the window, and a question about feverfew she'd been saving for 3 days, because it was a complicated one, and she wanted Maribel's full attention for it. She got the full attention. Maribel answered the feverfew question in more detail than strictly necessary, which Tilly took as the gift it was. After Tilly was in bed, and the dishes were done, and the kitchen had settled into its evening quiet, Maribel told Gideon about Dorothy Pressfield. She told it plainly, the way she told him most things without embellishment, without performing the emotion she'd felt during it, just the facts in order. He listened without interrupting. His coffee cup sat untouched. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something. "I'll talk to her," he said. "No," Maribel said immediately. He looked at her. "That's exactly the wrong thing to do," she said. "If you go talk to her, it looks like you're defending, like there's something to defend. It confirms everything they think they know." She shook her head. "I handled it. I heard how you handled it," he said. "But you shouldn't have to handle it alone." "I've handled things alone for most of my adult life," she said. "I'm not bad at it. That's not the point." "Then what is?" He set down his cup. He looked at her with the direct look, the one he used when he was done being careful. "The point is that you've been in this town for 3 months. You've done more for it in 3 months than most people do in years. And now it's going to repay you by whispering about your character." He paused. "That makes me angry." She looked at him. "I'm allowed to be angry about it," he said, "even if I'm not supposed to do anything about it." She thought about that for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you're allowed that." He picked up his cup. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing different," she said. "I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep coming to supper. I'm going to keep teaching Tilly about plants, and I'm going to keep learning from Vale, and I'm going to let the whispers run out of air on their own, because they always do, eventually, when you don't give them anything to feed on." He looked at her steadily. "And if they don't, then I'll deal with that when it happens." She met his look. "I didn't survive Silas Crowley's cowardice and a December epidemic to let Dorothy Pressfield's opinion rearrange my life." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile deeper than that, something more considered. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you did." There was a longer quiet then. The fire worked. The house settled. Outside, February was behaving like February on the plains, which was to say badly, with conviction. "Can I ask you something?" Maribel said. "Yes." "When you first took me to supper," she stopped, finding the words. "Was it only because Tilly pushed you into it? Or was some part of it your own choice?" He was quiet long enough that she almost said never mind. "Then, the first supper, mostly Tilly." He said it honestly, which she appreciated more than a comfortable answer would have been. "She has her mother's way of making you do things you didn't know you wanted to do yet." A pause. After that, "Mine." She nodded slowly. "You were the first person in 3 years," he said, "who talked to me like I was still a regular person, instead of either a grief case or a practical problem to be managed." He looked at the table. "You just talked to me, like a person." "You are a regular person," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I'd half forgotten." She thought about that, about how grief could do that, could make you feel like a particular category of human rather than just a human. She thought about how she'd spent years as the woman who stayed home and nursed and managed and been useful, and how that had made her feel less like a person and more like a function. I'd half forgotten too," she said. "Before Tilly grabbed my hand on that platform." He looked up. "She has good instincts. Terrifyingly good," Maribel agreed. "She's going to be a handful in about 10 years. He made a sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a laugh, and was probably the most unguarded sound she'd heard from him. "Don't tell me that. I thought you should be prepared." "I'm not prepared," he said. "I will never be prepared." She smiled. A real one, the kind that used her whole face, that she didn't monitor or portion out. He saw it, and looked slightly startled the way people look when they see something they weren't expecting to want to look at and find that they want to keep looking. She stood up and got her coat. "Good night, Gideon," she said. "I'll walk you to the road," he said. "It's cold and I know the way. I know you know the way." He stood and got his own coat. "I'll walk you to the road," she let him. March brought mud, which was its own category of problem on a ranch and a significant improvement over what February had been doing. The town began to breathe differently, the particular collective exhale of people who have gotten through a difficult stretch and are starting to believe the stretch is over. Vale formalized Maribel's apprenticeship with a document he had the town notary witness, which he presented to her one morning with the slightly elaborate casualness of a man who had put more care into something than he wanted to admit. "It's not a medical degree," he said, "but it establishes your standing clearly." In writing, with a seal, she looked at the document. Her name was on it in Vale's careful hand, followed by a long paragraph of language that used words like medical apprentice and authorized practitioner under supervision and continuing medical education. The notary's seal was at the bottom, slightly crooked because the notary's desk was uneven, and Vale had apparently not noticed until after. She felt the document's weight in her hands. "Thank you," she said. She said it carefully, meaning all of it. "Don't make it large," he said, which was her own phrase reflected back at her, and she understood then that he'd picked it up from her over the months and was using it deliberately. "It's just paper." "It's not just paper," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She had the document notarized copy pinned to the wall above her desk at the harness shop by that evening. She stood looking at it for a while before she went to sleep, in the way you look at something you've been working toward without knowing exactly what you were working toward. It was the 3rd week of March when the letter arrived. She almost didn't recognize the return address, a town 300 miles north, that she'd never heard of, written in a hand she didn't know. She opened it, expecting something administrative, maybe something forwarded from her home back east. What she found was 2 pages in a stranger's handwriting that explained with the particular thoroughness of someone who felt they owed an explanation where Silas Crowley had gone and why. The stranger was a woman named Harriet Polk, who identified herself as the wife of one of Silas's creditors. Her husband had been chasing Silas for 14 months over a land deal that had gone wrong, not just gone wrong, but been fraudulent from the start, a thing Silas had constructed carefully and collapsed deliberately when the time came. He'd done it before. He'd done it 3 times before, in 3 different places, to 3 different groups of people, and he'd run each time the walls closed in. The marriage advertisement, Harriet Polk wrote in her careful hand, had apparently been Silas's attempt to establish a veneer of respectability that he hoped might buy him time with the creditors. A man with a bride coming was a man with roots, with plans, with intention. When the debts had gotten too large even for that, he'd run before Maribel had arrived and left the veneer behind along with everything else. Harriet Polk was sorry, she wrote. She thought Maribel deserved to know the shape of it, even if the knowing came late. Maribel read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long while, in the way she sat with difficult things, letting herself actually feel the full weight of what it meant before she decided what to do with it. The anger was there. She acknowledged it without letting it take up more space than it deserved. The anger was directed not at the loss of Silas. She'd had very little grief about Silas, specifically, which had told her something about how much of the whole thing had been about him versus about what he'd represented, but at the specific, casual cruelty of being used, of being incorporated into someone else's scheme as an object, a prop for respectability, without being consulted or considered as a person at all. That part stung. It was right for it to sting. But here was the thing she sat with next. If Silas Crowley had not run, if he had been there on that platform in November, if she had married him and settled into whatever small, dishonest, ultimately collapsing life he'd been building, she would not be sitting in this room, above a harness shop with a notarized document on her wall, and a child who called her mama, and a man who walked her to the road in the cold because he'd decided he wanted to. She would be somewhere else in a different life, with a man who had looked at her and seen a tool. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer and felt, with some surprise, that she did not need to do anything else with it. It did not require response. It did not require revenge. It required absolutely nothing from her accept the acknowledgement that it had happened and was now behind her, and she had already been living that acknowledgement for 4 months without realizing it needed a name. She told Gideon that evening she hadn't planned to, but she arrived for supper and he looked at her and said, "What's in your head?" With the directness, he'd been developing a willingness to ask her things directly that had grown, alongside his willingness to be asked things directly. And she found herself telling him. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, his face held the particular set expression of a man who wants to say something physical about a person who isn't there and is making the decision not to. "He's not worth it," she said. "I know that," he said. "Doesn't mean I don't. I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," she said, and meant it. She stopped, finding the honest words. "I'm grateful, actually. I didn't expect that, but I think it's true." He looked at her with that slightly startled expression. "Grateful. For the outcome," she said. "Not for being used, I don't want to be strange about it, but for where the whole disaster landed me." She looked at the kitchen, the mismatched chairs, iron stove, the window over the sink, the plant book on the bench where Tilly had left it. "I came out here because someone promised me something, and I got something completely different." She looked at him. "Better, I think, if I'm honest." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I think so too," he said, quietly, plainly. The way he said the things that mattered. Something settled between them. Not resolved, not yet, not named, not acted on, but settled. The way foundation settles when it's been properly laid, and you can finally put weight on it without wondering if it will hold. Most of its windows were dark. Tilly came in from the other room with the plant book and 3 questions she'd been saving, which effectively ended the conversation, but in the way that interruptions can be merciful. It gave both of them a moment to breathe, to come back from wherever that exchange had briefly taken them. Maribel spent the next hour at the table with Tilly. Gideon sat across the room, mending a piece of tack that could probably have waited, and she knew without looking directly at him that he wasn't really thinking about the tack. April came in warmer than March had any right to promise. The mud dried on the roads. The ranch work picked up the spring push that Gideon was always slightly behind on and always caught up with through the particular combination of stubbornness and competence that characterized how he approached most things. He was in town less in April, which meant fewer meals at the kitchen table, which meant Tilly deputized herself to walk to the harness shop twice that month to bring Maribel a piece of bread from a batch she'd made herself. The bread was uneven and slightly underdone in the middle, and Tilly presented it with the critical self-assessment of someone who knew it wasn't her best work. "It's the first time I made it without someone watching," Tilly said. "The middle's wrong." "The first time I made bread alone, it didn't rise at all," Maribel said. "It came out like a very dense stone." "Did you eat it anyway?" "I threw it at a dog who'd been bothering the yard," Maribel said. "He didn't eat it either." Tilly covered her mouth, but the laugh came through anyway. She ate the bread. All of it. The slightly wrong middle and everything. It was in the first week of May that Agnes Haverford sat down with Maribel over tea, the kind of sit-down that Agnes conducted like a business meeting, formal in its intentions if not its setting, and said, "That man's going to say something eventually. I hope you're ready." Maribel did not ask which man. "I'm aware," she said. "He's slow," Agnes said. "He was slow before Clara died, and grief makes a slow person slower. But he's been looking at you since November, and you've been pretending not to notice. And I've been watching both of you be very careful and polite about it for 6 months, and I'm 71 years old, and I don't have patience for careful and polite." Maribel wrapped her hands around her teacup. "I'm not pretending not to notice," she said carefully. "Then what are you doing?" She thought about it. "Not rushing," she said. "There's a difference." Agnes made her verdict sound. "Don't not rush so long it becomes avoidance," she said. "Some people turn not rushing into a permanent condition." "I know," Maribel said. "I'm aware of the risk. Are you aware he was not going to feel like he has permission until you give it to him? That man won't step forward if he thinks he's stepping into your way. He'll stand at the edge of it forever before he'd push." Maribel looked at her. "You know him well." "I've known him since before Clara," Agnes said. "He's a good man. He's a careful man. He needs someone who isn't going to make him feel like a burden for wanting something, and for a long time he couldn't find that person." She looked at Maribel steadily. "Then you fell off a train." "I didn't fall off a train," Maribel said. Metaphorically, Agnes said unbothered. Maribel was quiet for a moment. I'm not going anywhere, she said finally. I think he knows that. But I can't, she stopped. Found the honest version. I spent most of my life arranging myself around what other people needed from me. My mother, my neighbors. The arrangement with Silas, such as it was. I need this, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the document on her wall and the work and the room and all of it, to be mine first. Clearly mine, before it becomes part of something else. Agnes looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded the decisive nod of someone who has heard something that satisfies them. That's a sensible answer, Agnes said. Don't take too long about it. She took the spring. She needed the spring. She worked through it steadily, building what she was building, the medical practice under Vale's roof and increasing guidance, the rounds she made through the families she'd come to know. The knowledge of its windows were dark, the knowledge she was accumulating in her note, now a second volume, the first having been filled by March. She taught Tilly every week. She had supper at the Rourke house 3 times a week, and sometimes 4 when the weather kept Gideon closer to town. She and Gideon had not talked again about the thing they had not talked about directly. But the space between them had changed the way spaces change when two people have been honest with each other. Less distance that had to be maintained, more ease. He'd started telling her things. Not big things, not declarations, but the small daily accounting of a person's actual life, what the East Fence was doing, what he thought about the water situation this summer, what Tilly had said in the morning that had caught him off guard. She did the same. It was the most ordinary kind of intimacy, the kind that builds without being named. He still walked her to the road when she left in the evenings. He'd never stopped doing that. One evening in late May, standing at the road's edge with the last of the daylight going pink and orange over the plains, in the way that the plains specialized in, extravagant and unself-conscious about it, Gideon said, "I'd like you to stay." She turned to look at him. "For supper," he added. Then he stopped. "No, I mean..." He stopped again with the expression of a man who has begun a sentence without sufficient preparation and is now fully committed to it. "I mean past supper. He looked at the horizon briefly, collecting himself. "I'm saying it wrong." "You're doing fine," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I want you to stay here, in this life, in some permanent way that I haven't figured out how to ask for properly." He said it with the blunt, slightly effortful honesty of someone who has rehearsed this less than they intended and is now speaking from somewhere more real than rehearsal. Not because Tilly needs you, though she does. Not because the house needs a woman in it, that's not... He stopped. "Because I want you here. Specifically you. I want to go on talking to you every evening and walking you to this road and coming in from the barn in the morning to find the coffee already on." She was very still. "I know that's not a proper," he started. "It's proper enough," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I told you that in November in so many words. I'm telling you again now, plainly, I'm not going anywhere, Gideon." He exhaled. It was slow and careful, like something he'd been holding for a while. "I'm not ready to ask you," he started. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to ask me. I'm just..." She found the right words. "I'm telling you the ground is solid. When you're ready." He looked at her in the plain's light, the pink and orange of it doing what it did. And she looked back, and there was no performance in it from either of them, just two people at the edge of a road in May being honest about what was true. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said. She walked home. Restless 11 minutes, by every rut and turn, back to the room that was hers, and the work that was hers, and the life she had built from the wreckage of someone else's cowardice. She was 31 years old, and she had lost everything she thought she was coming west for, and found something else entirely in its place. Something harder to name, and more solid than anything she'd planned for, and she thought as she climbed the stairs to her room that she was going to be all right. More than all right. She was going to be fine. Summer came to Hollow Ridge the way it always did, without asking, without apology, turning the plains from brown to a burnt gold that looked less like death than like something that had made peace with what it was. The work didn't slow in summer. If anything, it expanded, the way Maribel's days had been expanding since January, filling themselves with more than she'd originally thought she could hold. Vale had begun letting her handle initial consultations alone. Not the serious cases, not yet, but the routine ones. The earaches and the summer stomach complaints, cuts that needed cleaning and closing. She sat, across from patients at the desk that had been his for 30 years, and asked the questions she'd learned to ask, in the order she'd learned to ask them, and people answered her the way they answered him, with the particular mixture of honesty and embarrassment that people bring to medical offices, trusting that what they said would be held carefully. She was not him. She knew that. She had less experience and more to learn than she could calculate, and she knew that too. And she kept her notebook current and asked Vale every question she had and didn't pretend to certainty she didn't possess. But she was becoming something recognizable, something with a shape. The town had mostly settled around her. Not uniformly, Dorothy Pressfield still watched her with an expression that balanced between revised assessment and residual suspicion, but mostly. The epidemic had done what public crises sometimes do. It had forced people to see someone clearly, past the story they decided to tell about her, because the story had stopped being useful when their children were sick. What remained after was not universal warmth, which she hadn't expected and wouldn't have trusted anyway, but a basic functional respect, the kind that gets extended to people who've proven they know what they're doing and are going to keep doing it. Mrs. Harlow stopped her on the street in June and asked about a rash her husband had developed. The conversation was entirely medical and entirely normal, and neither of them referred to what had been said on the doorstep in December, because it had been addressed, and there was nothing more to add to it. Maribel gave her the advice she needed, and they parted without ceremony. That was enough. That was actually genuinely enough. Tilly turned 7 in June. Gideon made a cake that was structurally uncertain but tasted correct, and Maribel brought a wrapped package that contained a new plant book, not a replacement for the old one, which Tilly would have objected to, but a companion volume, one that covered different plants from a different region, expanding the map of what Tilly already knew. Tilly held it with both hands and looked at it, and looked at it, and then looked at Maribel with the expression she reserved for things that hit her exactly right open and a little overwhelmed, the way children look when something has understood them. It's the Western varieties, Maribel said, more applicable to where we actually are. Where we actually are, Tilly repeated. She held the book against her chest. That's what I wanted. I know, Maribel said. You told me in March. Tilly had mentioned it in passing during one of their plant sessions, the way children drop hints with that's what they're doing. Maribel had written it in the back of her notebook, not in the medical section, but in the small personal section she kept at the back for things she didn't want to lose track of. Gideon watched this exchange from across the table with the expression he'd been wearing with increasing frequency since May settled. Maribel had decided. It was the expression of a man who was no longer at war with himself about something. The summer moved forward. It was not a smooth summer, because nothing on the plains was ever smooth a drought scare in July that turned out to be 2 weeks of misery rather than the full catastrophe it threatened to be, a fire at the edge of the Clement property that spread too close to 3 other homesteads before the wind shifted, and the men of Hollow Ridge spent a night fighting it with water and dirt and a controlled stubbornness that was perhaps the defining characteristic of Frontier people. Gideon was out there with them, came home at dawn covered in soot and exhaustion, and Maribel was waiting at the ranch with water and clean cloths, because she'd heard from Pete that the fire had gotten close, and she hadn't been able to stay in her room. He sat at the kitchen table while she cleaned a burn on his forearm that he'd apparently decided wasn't worth mentioning. This needed attention hours ago, she said. I was busy, he said. I can see that. She worked carefully, the way she worked on everything. Does it hurt? Some. It's going to hurt more tomorrow. I know. He watched her hands. He watched her hands a lot. She'd noticed not in a way that made her self-conscious, but in the way people watch things they find trustworthy. Thank you for being here. Pete told me, she said. I didn't want to sit somewhere else not knowing. He looked at her directly. You were worried. Obviously, she said. Don't make me say it dramatically. I wouldn't, he said. And for the first time in a while, he actually smiled full, real, with his whole face behind it, the soot and exhaustion and relief all present in it at once. She'd seen him smile before, but not like this, not unguarded and honest, and aimed at her without reservation. She tied off the bandage and didn't immediately move away. I need to say something, he said. All right, she said. I've been trying to figure out how to do this properly, he said. I thought I'd wait until I had it worked out right. But I've been waiting since May, and I don't think it's going to get more worked out. She sat down across from him. He looked at his hands on the table, the bandaged one, the unbandaged one, and then back up at her. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because the town expects it, not because of Tilly, not because it's the proper resolution to a situation. Because I want to, because I have wanted to since sometime in February, and I've been trying to be patient about it." A pause. "I know you said the ground was solid, and I've been standing on that for 3 months. You have," she said. "I'm asking now," he said, "because I'm tired of not asking, and because I almost got significantly burned tonight, and it reorganized my thinking about what to wait for." She looked at him. The soot and the dawn light and the honest face of a man who was not performing anything at all. She thought about a train platform in November, $11 and a broken suitcase handle, and the cold. She thought about a small hand grabbing hers without permission. She thought about a December night with a child's fever breaking just before dawn and a cup of coffee placed beside her without a word. She thought about what she'd built here, the notarized document, the notebook in its second volume, the families who opened their doors to her, the life she had made out of someone else's abandonment. She thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived, and the woman she was now, and the distance between them, and how that distance had been crossed entirely on her own terms. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. "But," she said, he looked at her with careful attention. "I'm going to keep working," she said, "not as a side note to everything else, as the main thing alongside everything else. I will be Vale's apprentice, and eventually his successor and Hollow Ridge's physician in my own right. That doesn't become secondary because I'm your wife." "I know that," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to make it secondary." "I know you wouldn't," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." Out loud, so it's said. "It's said," he agreed. "And we're going to disagree about things," she said. "We already do. We're going to have to figure out how to do that, without either of us pretending we don't. We're already figuring it out," he said. "We are," she agreed. She looked at him. "And you need to let me help when you're hurt. Not find out about burns 4 hours after the fact." "That's a negotiation point," he said. "It's a condition," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Fine," he said. "Condition accepted." She reached across the table and put her hand over his bandaged one, carefully, avoiding the burn. "Yes," she said again, "just to be clear about it." He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was firm and careful at the same time, which was, she thought, exactly how he did most things. They told Tilly at breakfast. They had not planned for her to react the way she did, which was to look at them both for a single moment with an expression of profound, slightly exasperated vindication, and then say, "Finally." "Finally?" Gideon said. "I've been waiting since November," Tilly said. She picked up her fork. "The day she came off the train, I told you." "You told me she was your mama," Gideon said. "Yes," Tilly said. "And now she is. So I was right. She ate a bite of egg. I'm always right about important things." Maribel looked at Gideon. He looked at Maribel. "She gets it honestly," Maribel said. He rubbed his face with his free hand. "I know." The wedding was in September, which gave the summer its proper work, not the elaborate preparation of people with elaborate resources, but the ordinary preparation of a life being reorganized. Maribel kept her room above the harness shop until 2 weeks before the wedding, which raised exactly the eyebrows she'd expected, and which she bore with the equanimity she developed over 10 months of not letting other people's assessments rearrange her decisions. Agnes Haverford declared herself in charge of the wedding breakfast and ran that operation with the efficiency of a military campaign. The harness maker's wife made a dress with Maribel, not for her, with her, because Maribel had opinions about sleeves that she wasn't interested in compromising on. Dr. Vale, when asked to witness the ceremony, said obviously in the tone of a man who had been expecting this question for months. The ceremony itself was small. The justice of the peace, who was a practical man without ceremony about the things that didn't require it, kept it brief. They stood together in the front room of the justice's office on a Tuesday morning in September, with Agnes and Vale and Pete, the ranch hand, and the Brennan family, and a handful of others who had found reasons to be nearby. Tilly stood next to Maribel holding her hand. She had not asked permission to do this. She had simply taken the position and established it as a fact, which was, Maribel thought, entirely consistent with how she'd operated since the beginning. When the justice asked the relevant questions, Maribel answered clearly, without hesitation, without the particular tremor that comes from uncertainty. She was not uncertain. She was the least uncertain she had been about anything in years. Gideon answered the same way, direct, plain, meeting her eyes. That was all. That was everything. Afterward, Agnes's breakfast was substantial and slightly chaotic, with too many people in the Rourke kitchen and not quite enough chairs, and a conversation that ran in 7 directions at once, and the gray cat appearing from somewhere to sit in the exact center of the floor, looking put upon by the activity. Tilly ate an amount of cake that Gideon noticed and chose not to address. Vale sat in the corner and talked to the Brennan grandmother for an hour, and Maribel caught the old woman laughing in a way she hadn't heard from her before, and thought that was a good thing to know that there was still that kind of laugh in there. She moved into the ranch house properly in October. The same week, the first real cold of the year came in off the plains, and she brought with her the suitcase with the repaired handle. She had finally had it repaired in August, which Vale had considered a personal victory, 2 volumes of notebooks, the plant books she and Tilly had accumulated, her medical bag, which was now considerably more organized than the improvised one she'd assembled in December, and the notarized document which went on the wall in the room that became her study, the room where Gideon built her a proper desk from wood he'd salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding on the east side of the property. The desk was not elegant. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, and he'd addressed this with a thin wedge of wood that worked fine but was plainly visible. He'd asked if she wanted him to remake it. No, she said. I like that it shows the work. He looked at the wedge and then at her and shook his head slightly, but not with disagreement. They had their first real argument in October, which was about the east fence. She had opinions about how the repair should be prioritized based on what she'd observed about where the cattle moved. He had different opinions based on 30 years of ranching knowledge and a clear preference for not being told how to manage his own operation. They went at it for 20 minutes in the kitchen, in the kind of argument that is not mean but is genuinely contested, where neither person is performing displeasure and both are actually committed to their position. Tilly sat at the table through the whole thing with her plant book, reading with the studied absorption of someone who is absolutely listening and wants no one to notice. They arrived at a compromise that was neither of their original positions, and was probably better than either would have been alone. Gideon acknowledged this by not saying anything about it, which was his particular form of concession. Maribel acknowledged it by making coffee, which was hers. You were partly right, she said, handing him the cup. You were partly right, he said. They drank their coffee. That was uncomfortable, he said. Yes, she agreed. It'll probably happen again, I know. He looked at his cup. I'd rather argue with you than agree with someone who doesn't mean it. Good, she said. Because I have opinions about the North Water situation, too. He closed his eyes briefly. She could see the small muscle at the corner of his jaw doing something complicated. Tomorrow, he said. Let's do that one tomorrow. November arrived, and with it, the particular feeling that Maribel had been carrying differently this year than last, the anniversary of the train platform. Though she had not marked it formally, was present in the way significant dates are present, even when you don't observe them. A year. 1 year from the morning she'd stepped off that train with $11 and a broken suitcase handle and found nothing she'd expected and everything she hadn't known to look for. She went to the platform on a Tuesday morning. Not to commemorate, not to perform anything, just to stand there for a moment in the place where it had started, with the cold air doing what November cold did and take stock. The station agent was still there. He looked at her and recognized her and did something that might have been a small nod, the acknowledgement of a man who has watched someone's story improve considerably since the last time he was involved in it. She stood where she had stood, the bench where she'd sat counting $11, the window where she'd learned the shape of her disaster. She thought about the woman who had stood here 12 months ago, frightened underneath the calm, holding herself together with the particular stubbornness of someone who has done it so long they've forgotten it requires effort. That woman had been real, and she had been hers, and Maribel did not pity her or romanticize her. She had done what needed doing with what she had, which was all anyone could do, and it had been enough. The thing about broken promises, she thought the thing no one told you was that they didn't only take something away. They also freed you from something. The future you'd been imagining, the one you'd organized yourself around, that future and someone else's idea of what your life should be. When it collapsed, it left you in an open space that was terrifying and blank. And also, if you could stand in it long enough without running, yours. Really yours, in a way the planned future never would have been. She wasn't glad Silas Crowley had run. She didn't owe him gratitude. But she was standing on that platform, standing on that 12 months later with the cold in her face and the planes laid out behind the town like an argument for space, genuinely at peace with what his cowardice had cost her, because she could see clearly what it had also, accidentally given. She walked back through Hollow Ridge to Vale's office. There was a patient waiting. She sat down across from him, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and asked the first question. It was in the second week of November that the woman arrived. Maribel was leaving Vale's office when she saw her standing at the far end of the platform with a young child on her hip, maybe 2 years old, looking at the street with the expression Maribel recognized in her bones. The flat assessment of someone who has arrived somewhere they didn't entirely plan to and is trying to determine whether it's going to be survivable. The woman was young mid-20s, maybe, with the exhausted quality of someone who had been traveling too long. The child was asleep against her shoulder, despite the noise and the cold. The woman had one bag. It was tied closed with rope because the latch had broken. Maribel stopped walking. Around her, she could hear the town doing what the town did, the conversations, the assessments, the particular note that crept into voices when something unusual arrived to be evaluated. She could hear it because she knew what it sounded like now from both sides. She crossed the platform. "Hello," she said. The woman looked at her with the guarded readiness of someone who has learned that strangers approaching don't always mean well. "My name is Maribel Rourke," Maribel said. "I'm the physician's apprentice here. Are you all right?" The woman's guard didn't disappear, but something in it adjusted. "We're fine," she said. She stopped, looked at the street. "I don't actually know anyone here." "I know," Maribel said. "I could tell. Is it that obvious?" "Only to me," Maribel said, "because I arrived here the same way a year ago." The woman looked at her directly then. Young face, tired eyes, the particular set of someone carrying more than what was physically in her arms. "What did you do?" she said. "When you got here?" "I found work," Maribel said. "I was stubborn about it. It took time." She paused, and a 6-year-old grabbed my hand, which helped considerably. The woman almost smiled. It was tentative. The way smiles are tentative when you haven't used one in a while. "I don't know anyone here," she said again, less as information and more as admission. "You know me," Maribel said. "That's a start." She shifted. "There's a place down the street that serves coffee. Why don't you let me buy you a cup, and you can tell me what you need, and we can figure out where to begin." The woman looked at her for a moment. The child shifted in her sleep, made a small sound, went still again. "Why?" the woman said, not hostile, genuinely asking. Maribel thought about a small girl in a blue dress with braids coming undone, pointing at a stranger on a platform with absolute confidence. She thought about Agnes Haverford opening her door and saying, "Proper, I need help with." She thought about Gideon the first night, saying, "Friend of the family," because it was the most generous framing available. "Because someone did it for me," she said more than once, and it made the difference. She didn't add the rest, the part she believed, about how the best things you received in hard times you eventually paid forward, not as debt, not as obligation, but as recognition that the world's worst moments and its best kindnesses were often inseparable. That the same broken promise that stripped you of everything could be the thing that placed you exactly where you needed to be. She didn't say all of that. It was too large for a platform in the cold. She just stood there with her hand slightly extended, the same gesture that had been extended to her, and waited. The woman shifted the child to her other hip and took the hand. They walked down the street together into the warmth of the coffee shop, and Maribel listened. That was the first thing listening. The story came out in pieces, the way stories come out when someone hasn't had anyone to tell it to, halting and then faster and then halting again. A husband who had gone ahead 6 months ago to find work and sent 2 letters and then stopped. A family that could no longer keep her. A journey taken on the last of her money because forward was the only direction available. Maribel recognized everything in this story. Not the specific details, her details had different filters, but the shape of it. The particular shape of a woman who has run out of other options and is now learning that the place you run out of options can sometimes be the place you begin. "There's room at the harness shop," Maribel said. "My old room. It's cheap, and the window doesn't close all the way, but it's dry. She had already talked to the harness maker's wife about it 2 weeks ago. In the impractical way, she sometimes did things prepared for a situation before she knew the situation would arrive. And Agnes Haverford needs help. She's not easy to work for, but she pays fair and she doesn't ask questions you haven't answered already. The woman looked at her over the coffee cup. You've thought about this. Not specifically, Maribel said, generally. In case someone arrived like you did. Yes. Does that happen often? Here? Maribel thought about it honestly. This is the frontier, she said. People arrive all the time with less than they plan to. Some of its windows were dark. Some of them find a way through it, and some of them don't. And a lot of what makes the difference is whether someone stops to look them in the face before the town gets a chance to decide what to think of them. The woman was quiet for a moment. The child had woken up and was looking around the coffee shop with the calm, wide-eyed assessment of a very young child taking in a new environment with scientific interest. Her name's Pearl, the woman said, nodding at the child. I'm Nora. Nora, Maribel said, I'm going to help you figure out the next few weeks. After that, it's yours to manage. But the next few weeks, I can help with those. Nora looked at her with something that was not yet fully trust, but was the beginning of it, which was enough. Trust built slowly in people who'd been let down before, and that was not a flaw, it was sense. All right, Nora said. Maribel told Gideon that evening about Nora and Pearl. She told him at the kitchen table, after Tilly had gone to bed, the way she told him, the things she wanted him to know directly, without building up to them. He listened. He nodded slowly. The harness shop room, he said. She needs somewhere dry and cheap while she gets settled. I've already spoken to the Hartleys about it. He looked at her. You did this before you knew she was coming. I had a feeling something like this would happen eventually, she said. The train keeps running. People keep arriving. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the expression she'd come to know that settled, honest quality. You've been here a year, he said. He stopped, finding the right word. You're already who you're going to be here. Is that a good thing? She said. It's a remarkable thing, he said. Yes. She looked at the table. She wasn't easy with being called remarkable. It made her uncomfortable in the way compliments sometimes do when they name something you've worked at, but we're hoping wouldn't be too visible. I just know what it looked like from the other side of it, she said. That's what makes it remarkable, he said. People who've been through hard things usually either build walls or build doors. You built a door. She looked at him. It was one of the longer sentences she'd heard from him without prompting, and it had landed somewhere it was supposed to. You've been talking to Agnes, she said. Agnes talks, he said. Sometimes I listen. She laughed, the full one, unmonitored. He smiled at the sound of it. Winter came back. The second one she would spend in Hollow Ridge, and it was different from the first, not easier. The planes didn't do easy, but different in the way that the same difficult thing is different when you're inside it rather than being thrown at it from outside. She knew what to prepare for now. She knew the way the cold worked in this particular house, which window bled the most heat, how the water froze in the pump if you left it too long, how Gideon moved through heavy ranch work in January, with the slightly mechanical efficiency of a man who has survived many winters by not wasting energy being dramatic about them. She knew Tilly's patterns, how she got quieter in deep cold, retreating into her books and her inner life, needing to be drawn out with specific rather than general attention. She knew to check in on Agnes weekly because Agnes would not ask for help even when she needed it. She knew which of her patients were most likely to ignore symptoms until they became crises. She knew the shortcut across the Jensen property that knocked 3 minutes off the walk to Vale's office. She knew the shape of this life. And the shape of it was, she thought, on a January morning standing at the window of her study, with coffee warming her hands and the plains going white and flat to the horizon. Not what she had imagined on the train. Not what she'd planned for or hoped for in those careful letters she'd written to Silas Crowley that he'd apparently been using as props in someone else's confidence scheme. It was better. Messier and harder and better. Tilly came in without knocking, which she never did, and sat on the edge of the desk with the plant book open to a page she'd been arguing with for 3 days. This one, she said, pointing. The description says the flowers are yellow, but I saw one growing near the east fence, and it was almost orange. Are they wrong? Maribel looked at the page. They're not wrong. The color varies based on soil composition and how much sun the plant gets. What you saw was probably at the end of its season, when the pigment shifts. Tilly looked at this information with the focused consideration she gave everything worth considering. So the book is right, but not completely right. Books are like that, Maribel said. They tell you the general shape. The specific thing in front of you is always slightly different. Tilly absorbed this. That's true about people too. Yes, Maribel said. It is. Tilly looked at the page, then at Maribel, then at some middle distance between them, where she apparently kept her most complicated thoughts. Are you happy? She said. In the direct, uncushioned way she asked most things. Maribel looked at her. 7 years old and already asking the questions that adults spent decades avoiding. Yes, she said. I think I am, you think? Happy is a word I use carefully, Maribel said. It means different things at different times. Right now, I mean I'm in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people. She paused. That's what it is for me. That's what happy is when it's real, and not just pleasant. Tilly considered this for a moment. That's what I thought, she said, as if it confirmed something. What did you think? Maribel said. That you were happy, Tilly said. Since about February. She slid off the desk with the book under her arm. Last February, when you stopped counting things. She was gone before Maribel could respond to that, padding back down the hall in her wool socks, unconcerned with the weight of what she'd just said. Maribel stood at the window with her coffee and thought about it. Tilly was right. She had stopped counting. At some point, the need to quantify the walk, the money, the minutes before she needed to leave the constant quiet arithmetic of a person who is measuring whether there is enough, had simply stopped. She hadn't noticed the stopping. She'd just been going to sleep without adding things up and waking without calculating what the day was going to cost. That was what safety felt like from the inside, she realized. Not comfort, not ease, not the absence of difficulty. She had plenty of difficulty, would have more. Safety felt like not counting. Gideon found her there 20 minutes later when he came in from the morning feeding. You're standing at the window, he observed. Thinking, she said. He poured his coffee and came to stand beside her. He looked out at the same white flat distance she'd been looking at. He was still learning to do this, to stand beside her without needing to be useful about it. And he was getting better. Good thinking or difficult thinking, he said. Good, she said. Surprisingly good. He was quiet. His arm was against hers, their shoulders almost touching, both of them looking at the winter plains that were nobody's idea of beautiful and were somehow entirely beautiful anyway. The scale of it, the honesty of it, the way it went on past what you could see, without caring whether you could see that far. I was thinking about when I arrived, she said. November, he said. November, $11. Broken handle. She looked at the distance. I've been thinking about what I was looking for when I got on that train. What I thought I was going to find. He waited. He'd gotten very good at waiting. I thought I was looking for a home, she said. That's what the letters said. A home. Someone to belong to. A place to stop moving, and he said. And I found all of those things, she said. But not in the way I expected. I didn't find them because someone offered them to me. She looked at her coffee. I built them. Out of laundry and plant books and sick children and 12-hour nights and one impossible, wonderful, stubborn little girl who grabbed my hand on a platform and refused to let go. She felt him shift beside her, not away toward. You stayed, he said. I stayed, she said. It was the same thing Tilly had said to her in the dark of a fever-sick room 8 months ago, barely a whisper, raw and certain. You stayed. And her answer then had been the same as it was now, and would be, of course. Of course she stayed. Because this was what she'd learned in Hollow Ridge, in the hard and imperfect year of building something real from nothing at all. That home was not a place you were given. It was a place you stayed long enough to make. That belonging was not a thing someone handed you, not a husband, not a promise, not a letter in careful ink. It was something you built in the small daily acts of choosing people, and choosing work and choosing every day to remain when remaining was hard. She had arrived in Hollow Ridge because a man made her a promise he never intended to keep. She had stayed because she found something worth keeping herself. That was not the story she'd planned to live. She was beginning to think it was the better one. Outside, the plains lay flat and cold and enormous under a January sky, exactly the same as they had always been, entirely indifferent to the small, warm light in one ranch house window. But the light was there. The coffee was hot. Somewhere down the hall, Tilly was having an argument with the plant book about flower colors. The gray cat appeared from nowhere and arranged itself on the windowsill in the patch of weak winter sun with the satisfied certainty of an animal that has arranged the world to its exact specifications. Gideon reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just the way you take the hand of someone who is standing beside you, because they're standing beside you, and that is the whole and sufficient reason. She held on. The plains went on to the horizon, and the horizon went on past that, and in the house the warmth stayed, because they kept making it, all three of them, the way warmth has always been made, not found, not given, not promised by anyone built, with whatever was at hand, and tended, and chosen every single day.